In 1983, 3-year-old Michelle Newton was living in Kentucky with her parents, Deborah and Joseph. The family was planning a move to Georgia. Deborah told her husband that she needed to move down early to start her new job and get the family's new home set up for them. She took Michelle with her, leaving on April 2nd. However, when Joseph later arrived in Georgia to meet them, there was no sign of his wife or daughter. He would get a farewell phone call from Deborah a year or two later, but she had taken Michelle and would not let him see or speak to her. Neither he nor law enforcement could find them. An arrest warrant was issued for Deborah for custodial interference. Joseph actively campaigned to find his daughter for years after her abduction, posting flyers and giving media interviews. At one point, police believed Deborah may have taken Michelle to Clayton County, Georgia. Nothing came of that lead. Deborah was one of the FBI's top 8 most wanted parental kidnapping fugitives, but eluded capture. The arrest warrant for Deborah was dismissed in 2000, and Michelle was removed from the missing children's database in 2005 due to clerical errors. But that was corrected when a member of her family got in contact with police to ask for additional help in the search for her in 2015. The case was formally reopened in 2016, and the arrest warrant for Deborah was reissued. On October 5th, 2024, Michelle's 45th birthday, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed image of Michelle, hoping that someone would recognize her. In early 2025, a tip came into Crime Stoppers, claiming that Deborah Newton was living under a different name in Marion County, Florida. A U.S. Marshals Task Force detective followed up on the tip and confirmed that the Florida woman resembled a 1983 photo of Deborah Newton. DNA samples from Deborah's sister and the woman in Florida confirmed that the woman was, in fact, Deborah Newton. 66-year-old Deborah, now going by the name Sharon, had remarried at some point and had retired with her husband to the Villages, Florida. Michelle had, unbeknownst to her, been living under a false name. She did not learn her true identity until police showed up at her home. They told her that she was not who she thought she was. She was, in fact, a missing person named Michelle Marie Newton. Michelle had no idea that her mother had abducted her. She had felt that something was off about her life and the stories her mother had told her. She immediately contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Kentucky so that she could be put in contact with her father. Michelle and Joseph reunited in Kentucky over Thanksgiving of 2025. Describing the reunion, Joseph said, "She's always been in our heart. I can't explain that moment of walking in and getting to put my arms back around my daughter. I wouldn't trade that moment for anything. It was just like seeing her when she was first born. It was like an angel." Deborah was arrested in Florida, and a family member posted her bond. She voluntarily appeared in court back in Kentucky to be arraigned on a felony charge of custodial interference, with both her daughter and her ex-husband in attendance. Michelle is happy to be reunited with her father and extended family, but is trying to be sympathetic to whatever reasons her mother may have had for making the decisions she did. Michelle told local news station WLKY, "My intention is to support them both through this, and to try to navigate and help them both. Just wrap it up so that we can all heal." Margaret Anselmo was a lifelong resident of Spokane, Washington. In 1997, 45-year-old Margaret was the loving mother of 2 children and working as a floral designer. On January 3rd of that year, she left her apartment to cash a check. She never returned home. Margaret's body was discovered in an alley in the 700 block of East Pacific Avenue in Spokane. Her death was ruled a homicide, the result of blunt force trauma to the head. She had also been raped. There was still money in her purse, so robbery was ruled out as a potential motive. At the time of the murder, an STR DNA profile was developed from the evidence collected at the crime scene. There were no matches to it in the FBI's combined DNA index system. The case went cold. Margaret's daughter Lisa feared that the case did not get enough attention from police over the years because her mother had a history of mental illness. In 2022, the Spokane Police Department and Washington State Patrol Crime Lab began working with Othram Inc. in Texas on Margaret's case. They were able to use their forensic-grade genome sequencing to identify a more complete DNA profile than had previously been available. Othram's in-house genetic genealogy teams were able to use this profile to provide investigators in Washington with possible leads. Then, Linda Kinne, a local genealogist who volunteered with the Spokane Police Department, studied local records about the families identified by Othram and was able to identify local individuals she believed could be relatives of the killer. Detectives then contacted these potential relatives and asked for their help. When they were told about Margaret's murder and their relatives' potential involvement in the case, they were very upset about the murder and its impact on Margaret's family. They wanted to help with the investigation. They provided samples of their own DNA for comparison. DNA testing and comparison showed that the contributor of the DNA from Margaret's crime scene was the father of one of the individuals who had volunteered a DNA sample, and the half-brother of another. The killer was Brian James Anderson. Anderson was just 20 years old at the time of the murder. His name had never previously come up during the investigation. Unfortunately, he could not be arrested for the crime because he had taken his own life on July 8, 2009, in Penderell County, Washington. On November 12, 2025, the Spokane Police Department announced that if Anderson had still been alive, they would have sought to charge him with first-degree murder and first-degree rape. George David was a member of the Chilliwack First Nation on Vancouver Island. He was born in Port Alberni on the island in August of 1950, the youngest of 14 children. The family moved to Arizona when he was 8 years old, which was quite a climate shock for him, coming from the rain, forests, and beaches of Vancouver Island. The family eventually moved to Seattle, Washington, and George ultimately settled in Neah Bay, just across the Salish Sea from Vancouver Island. He raised his daughter Maria there and made regular trips back to the island. George was a master woodcarver whose work was displayed all around the world. He had pieces as part of the royal collections in Norway and on display in the City Hall of Kobe, Japan. He crafted two 36-foot canoes for the gravesite of Chief South, also known as Chief Seattle. George technically only had one daughter and 2 grandchildren, but he had more than 40 members of his extended family refer to him as Grandpa, out of respect for the strong paternal presence he had in their lives. George's life came to a tragic end when he was just 65 years old. On March 28, 2016, his body was discovered in the apartment of one of his friends in Port Angeles, Washington. He was in Port Angeles because he was traveling from Neah Bay to British Columbia to attend a funeral and see his family. His death was ruled a homicide, the result of blunt force trauma to the head. The initial investigation identified 45-year-old Tina Marie Alcorn, a woman living a transient lifestyle, as a potential suspect in the case. However, police did not have enough evidence to charge her. They did arrest and extradite her, as she was wanted for a parole violation and unrelated felony charge in the state of Arkansas. The Port Angeles Police Department reached out to the state attorney general's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and People Cold Case Investigations Unit for help in the investigation in 2024. The state crime lab re-examined the evidence from the case and performed DNA testing, which ultimately tied Alcorn to the crime. An arrest warrant was issued for her in June of 2025, and police traveled from Washington to Arkansas, where they located and arrested her. Alcorn pleaded guilty to second-degree murder with a deadly weapon enhancement. On December 15, 2025, she was sentenced to 13 years in prison. The murder had weighed heavily on Georgia's family. Even though Alcorn received a short sentence, they feel a sense of relief, and as though it will help them as they heal. Zachary Jackson was a native of Modesto, California. In 1993, the 30-year-old father of two was living in an unincorporated area of Hayward, California, in Alameda County. His 4-year-old daughter was in his custody, while his children's mother had custody of their 1-year-old. That June, his family became concerned when they did not hear from him for several days. On June 17th, they went to his home to check on him. There, they discovered his body. He had been shot to death. Police initially investigated the crime as the result of a conflict between Zachary and his landlord. Once that theory was ruled out, the case went cold. 21 years later, in 2014, police received a tip claiming to identify those responsible for Zachary's murder. However, there was what police later described as a roadblock, which prevented them from further investigating the case and this lead at the time. In 2021, another witness willing to go on record came forward, but again, there were still impediments to the investigation in place. It was not until the latter part of 2025 that police were able to make progress with the case. They located additional cooperative witnesses at that time. The reason investigators have been so vague about the investigation is because there are finally active criminal charges in the case. On November 6, 2025, U.S. Marshals arrested 54-year-old Veronica Fonseca at her home in Queens, New York. A few hours later, police in Sioux City, Iowa, arrested 56-year-old Anthony Fox as he walked out of his home. Both were facing extradition to California to face charges for Zachary's murder. Fonseca is the mother of Zachary's children. Fox was her boyfriend at the time Zachary was killed. Police believe that Fox pulled the trigger, but that both of them were present for the murder. They are both charged with murder and burglary, with a sentencing enhancement for the use of a firearm during the commission of a felony that could add additional prison time if they are found guilty. The arrests came more than 32 years after Zachary was killed. While discussing the arrests and killers who are not immediately caught, Alameda County Sheriff's investigator Patrick Smith said, "There is no statute of limitations on murder. We may not get you tomorrow, next week, next month, but keep looking over your shoulder, because you never know when the long arm of the law is gonna reach out and touch you." Nick Lopsis was a very easygoing and lovable young man. He liked to wander around his hometown of Richmond, Virginia, exploring abandoned buildings and meeting new people in local parks. He liked to talk to anyone and enjoyed teasing his friends. He worked loading trucks at the Civitas workshop. He loved working hard and earned quite a good amount of money for someone with his position because he was paid per truck he loaded. He worked very hard throughout his shift, so he would get quite a lot of trucks loaded each day. Nick still lived with his mother into adulthood, as he had an intellectual disability. He finally left home under less than ideal circumstances. Nick was arrested for trespassing after he scaled a fence at Richmond's Capitol Square. a judge determined that he required more constant supervision, so on January 22, 1979, 28-year-old Nick moved into a group home in Richmond. Nick was reported missing just 4 months later, on May 31st, after he left the group home but never arrived at work. Nick's sisters made appeals to the public for information through media interviews at the time. By their own admission, Nick was somewhat gullible as a result of his intellectual disability. They feared that someone had taken advantage of him and had taken him to a migrant work camp and not allowed him to leave. It would be 46 years before any of them would learn what had happened to their brother. On August 28, 1979, partial human remains had been found along the James River in Sturgeon Point, Charles City County, Virginia. It was believed that they belonged to a man of Caucasian or Hispanic descent. The remains, which came to be known as John Charles City Doe 1979, were not identified at the time. Reconstructions of what he may have looked like when he was alive and images of the clothes he had been found wearing were released over the years, but no one reported recognizing him. In October of 2025, the Virginia Office of the Chief Medical Examiner went to the DNA Doe Project to ask for their help in the case. Through genetic genealogy, the team there soon learned that John Charles City Doe 1979 was related to a family in West Virginia on his mother's side. He was not Hispanic as had been originally theorized, but instead of Southern European descent from his father's side. In going through the records of the West Virginia family, they learned of a woman who had moved to Washington, D.C., where she had met and married a man who had been born in Greece. They had children together, including a son. There were no records of him after the 1970s. This man was Nick Lopsis. Only one of Nick's sisters was still alive at the time. Virginia State Police visited her, and she informed them that her family had reported Nick missing in 1979 and never seen him again. She provided a DNA sample so that it could be compared to the DNA sample taken from John Charles City Doe 1979. On November 24, 2025, DNA confirmed that John Charles City Doe 1979 was in fact Nick Lopsis. Foul play is not suspected in Nick's case, and his missing persons case is officially closed. When Nick's remaining family was notified of the identification, they were of course sad to learn that Nick was dead, but also relieved now that they finally had some answers about what had become of him. Joseph Godcharles had a long career working in pharmacies. He started out working at the small pharmacy his father owned in Clearwater, Florida, and later got the opportunity to work as a manager for the larger pharmacy chains like Eckerd and Walgreens. He was a longtime manager at the Walgreens in Immokalee. Joseph worked 50 to 60 hours a week. In what little free time he had, he enjoyed boating with his father Warren and taking trips to Key West. On August 1st, 2012, 48-year-old Joseph was scheduled to have his weekly breakfast with his 20-year-old son Ryan. Ryan arrived at his father's condo in the Key Royal Villas community in Naples, Florida at 9:16 a.m. When he arrived, he made a terrible discovery. His father's body was on the floor of his bedroom. He had been stabbed to death. His time of death was placed between 8:24 p.m. on July 31st, when he entered his key code to enter his gated community, and 9:16 a.m. on August 1st, when his son found his body. The door to the condo had been unlocked when Ryan arrived. There were no signs of forced entry into the condo, and nothing had been stolen. This led investigators to believe that Joseph may have known his killer. Police checked the security footage from Joseph's condo community, but found no leads. The case went cold. 13 years later, thanks to DNA evidence, an arrest was finally made in Joseph's case. On December 12, 2025, Collier County Sheriff Kevin Rambosk and State Attorney Amira Fox announced that 53-year-old Julie Krinsky had been arrested at her home in Beverly Hills, Florida, the day before, and was being extradited to Collier County to face a charge of second-degree murder in the death of Joseph Godcharles. Joseph did know the person now accused of killing him. He and Krinsky were longtime friends who had been in a romantic relationship at one point. The exact nature of the DNA evidence against her has not been made public due to the ongoing legal proceedings. Kathryn "Kathy" Donohue was a native of Allentown, Pennsylvania, but she eventually moved to Washington, D.C. for a job. In 1979, 31-year-old Kathy was living in Arlington, Virginia, and working as a union secretary. Kathy was very outgoing and well-liked. On March 2, 1979, she went out to dinner at a restaurant in Georgetown with some of her coworkers. She never made it home afterwards. The following morning, her body was found by a person walking through a parking lot on Hamlin Street in Glenarden, Maryland. She had been brutally beaten, strangled, and raped. Kathy's body was found miles away from her home in Virginia. She had taken a cab home from the restaurant the night before her body was found, but police could never identify the driver. With no witnesses or suspects, Kathy's case went cold. The killer had left DNA behind on Kathy's body, which would prove to be critical evidence a few decades later. The DNA was retested over the years, but it did not identify a potential suspect. Then, in 2020, the Prince George's County State's Attorney applied for and received federal funding to use genetic genealogy in some of the county's cold cases. Investigators obtained a court order to allow them to use the technique in Kathy's case, as is required by Maryland law. Investigators found a distant relative of the killer in a commercial DNA database, and then spent 38 months working with Othram Inc. to build a family tree and retest the DNA evidence. The effort ultimately did identify a potential suspect. This potential suspect was living in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Investigators retrieved a plastic fork from the trash can outside of his house and tested it for DNA. The DNA from the fork was a match to DNA found on the slip Kathy had been wearing at the time of her murder. In March of 2025, police returned to the home to arrest its occupant. 82-year-old Roger Zotis Brown was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, rape, and related counts in Kathy's murder. There is currently no known connection between Brown and Kathy Donohue. Upon his arrest, Brown's demeanor was reportedly cold, and he showed no reaction. He is awaiting extradition to Maryland to face the charges against him. Brown does have a criminal record. He had been arrested in 1967 and served an 11-year sentence for armed robbery in Nassau County, New York. He was released in June of 1978, less than a year before Kathy was killed. At the time of her murder, he had been living in Hyattsville, a city in the same county where Kathy was murdered. He had moved to North Carolina in 2017. While several members of Kathy's family have passed away since her murder, her brother and sister are still alive. Following Brown's arrest, they released a statement thanking investigators for their ongoing work on Kathy's case. We will always be grateful for their determination, their compassion, and their relentless pursuit of the truth, which has finally given us a sense of closure that we never thought possible after all this time, they said. On April 20th, 2002, police in Copley, Ohio were called out to the Red Roof Inn on Rothrock Road for a report that there was a man slumped over in the driver's seat of a Chevrolet van parked there. When they arrived, they realized that the man was dead. He had been shot once in the head. For the first time in 3 years, there had been a murder in Copley Township. The victim was 28-year-old Stephen Lindsey. Stephen was a kind and giving person who had many friends. He made people feel like they were a part of his family, and he would do anything to help them. His death was therefore a great loss to his community, as well as a complete shock, since no one who knew him could think of a reason why anyone would want to kill him. Police also could not find any witnesses or any reports of suspicious behavior in the area, leaving them with few leads to follow. They conducted dozens of interviews, even traveling out of state to conduct some of them, but could still not identify Stephen's killer. The case would remain cold for more than 20 years, and only be solved thanks to a deathbed confession. Shortly after Stephen's murder, police had identified a prime suspect, a 20-year-old named Neil Anderson. However, they did not have sufficient evidence to confirm their suspicions, and therefore never charged him with the crime. Anderson did spend some time in prison for drug-related offenses in the years after Stephen's murder. He died in March of 2023 after battling a serious illness. In November of 2024, Anderson's brother, whose name has not been released, came to police. The brother informed them that Neil had confessed to killing Stephen Lindsey while he was on his deathbed. Neil had also provided specific details about the crime that only the police and the killer would know. Neil claimed to have shot Stephen because Stephen had let him borrow some money, and Neil did not want to pay him back. Neil's brother told police that he had waited a year and a half to inform them of the confession because he wanted to spare his family the pain of knowing what Neil had done. Neil's brother passed away just 1 month after telling police of Neil's deathbed confession. Investigators then spent several months continuing to work on the case. When they were confident that they had sufficiently verified the information provided by Neil Anderson's brother, they closed the case. In March of 2025, they announced that Stephen's murder was considered solved and identified Neil Anderson as his killer. According to one of Stephen's friends, even though Anderson is not alive to be prosecuted for the crime, the announcement of his identification has given Stephen's mother some sense of closure. Lachelle Shelley Waite was a kind and loving young woman with a good heart and a future full of promise. The 18-year-old was a recent graduate of Maryvale High School in Phoenix, Arizona, where she had tutored other students and been active in choir and dance. At the beginning of 1986, Shelley was working at a discount department store in the Maryvale Mall. That January 16th, Shelley's 20-year-old sister Annette went to Shelley's home near 59th Avenue and Thomas Road to give her a ride to work. When Annette went inside, however, she discovered her younger sister's body in a bedroom. She had been strangled to death. Several items, including jewelry and a gun, had been stolen from Shelley's home, but there were no signs of forced entry. Police therefore theorized that Shelley may have known her killer to some degree. According to a later press release from the Phoenix Police Department, detectives had a strong investigative lead at the time, but didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest, and the case went cold. In 2016, detectives with Phoenix Police Department's Cold Case Homicide Unit completed a full review of Shelley's case. In doing so, they identified a piece of evidence that investigators had been unable to process in 1986. Presumably, this is because the technology needed to test for DNA was not widely available to law enforcement yet. In 2022, the cold case team was finally able to have the evidence submitted for advanced DNA testing. The exact nature of the evidence has not been publicly disclosed, presumably due to ongoing legal proceedings. This testing did identify a suspect. On February 20th, 2025, 70-year-old Alfred Earl Green was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, with his arrest being made 39 years after Shelley was killed. It is the oldest cold case homicide arrest in the history of the Phoenix Police Department. At the time of his arrest, Green was already incarcerated. In 1989, he had received a life sentence after being convicted of a different murder. In 1988, he shot and killed his ex-girlfriend, 29-year-old Yolanda Taylor, in front of her 2 children. It has been reported that Green had been a friend of Shelley's boyfriend at the time she was killed. Prosecutors allege that Green sold the jewelry and firearm stolen from Shelley's home shortly after her murder. Green had his first court appearance in relation to Shelley's case on February 22nd, and the proceedings are ongoing. During a press conference announcing Green's arrest, Phoenix detective Dominic Rostenberg said, "Being able to finally let the family know, and also let the community know, that after 39 years, we're still working on these cases, trying to get justice for them, for the victims and their families, speaks to what this unit is all about." On June 28, 1997, a man and his daughter were on a hike in Hempstead Lake State Park in Lakeview, New York, on Long Island. In a wooded area adjacent to McDonald Pond, they came across a green Rubbermaid storage container. Inside was a maroon towel, some gold jewelry, a floral bedsheet, and a black trash bag. When he opened the trash bag, the man discovered something horrifying: the dismembered torso of a young African-American woman. The young woman's head, both arms, and both legs below the knee had been severed and were not found at the crime scene. It would later be determined that she had died several days before her remains were found. Only having partial remains made identifying the victim difficult. Investigators could not use fingerprints, dental records, or facial reconstruction to make an identification. The torso did have some identifying marks, including a cesarean scar and a tattoo on the left breast. The tattoo was of a heart-shaped peach with a bite taken out of it, and 2 drops of liquid falling from it. Since the young woman's real name was unknown, she was eventually given the nickname Peaches because of this tattoo. Since the tattoo was their best clue, police turned to the tattoo artist community for help. In addition to getting the case featured in more mainstream media, such as on America's Most Wanted, they also published a photo of the tattoo in a national tattoo magazine in hopes that the artist who had done the tattoo would recognize it and hopefully identify the young woman. The effort did pay off in that the artist came forward, but he could not provide the name of the young woman. Stephen Cullen contacted police to tell them that he had done that tattoo at his shop in Bristol, Connecticut in 1996. The young woman he had done it for told him that she was in Connecticut at the time because of some boyfriend trouble. He believed she had said she was from the Bronx or Long Island. He could not remember her name or other identifying information. There were no more major developments in the case until 2011, although they stemmed from events that took place in 2010. On May 1st, 2010, a panicked Shannon Gilbert called 911 after fleeing from a home in Oak Beach, New York, and knocking on the door of a neighboring house asking for help. Shannon disappeared after making the call and remained missing until December 13, 2011, when her remains were found in nearby marshlands. Her death was controversially ruled an accidental drowning by the medical examiner the following May. However, during police searches for Shannon, the remains of 10 homicide victims were discovered along the north side of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. In December 2010, the remains of 4 victims who would later come to be known as the Gilgo Four were found within a quarter mile of each other. The other 6 sets of remains were located during searches in March and April of 2011 along Ocean Parkway in both Suffolk and Nassau counties. The 10 sets of remains were bookended by partial adult human remains, referred to as Jane Doe No. 3 to the west, and the remains of a toddler, known as Baby Doe, at the farthest east location. Baby Doe's remains were located on April 4, 2011, and Jane Doe No. 3's remains were found a week later, on the 11th. Baby Doe's body had been found just 250 yards away from another set of partial human remains. However, DNA testing would eventually show that the unidentified toddler was the child of the individual whose partial remains had been found the farthest away from them along the parkway. On September 20th, 2011, it was determined that Baby Doe was the daughter of Peaches, whose torso had been discovered 14 years earlier. In December of 2016, Peaches and Jane Doe No. 3 from the Ocean Parkway scene were conclusively shown to be the same person, although the identity of that person remained unknown. The bodies found near Gilgo Beach received international attention because of concerns that the dumping ground of a serial killer had been discovered. The theoretical killer came to be known as the Long Island serial killer. On July 14, 2023, 59-year-old Rex Heuermann of Massapequa Park was charged in relation to the murders of Megan Waterman, Melissa Bartholomew, and Amber Costello, and he was named as a suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. These 4 women were the Gilgo Four, whose remains had first been found. Heuermann was indicted for Maureen's murder on January 16, 2024. That June 6th, he was indicted on 2 more counts of murder in the cases of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla. Then, on December 17, 2024, he was also charged with the murder of Valerie Mack, whose remains had been found close to Baby Doe's. He has pled not guilty to all charges and has not yet gone to trial. While there had been a major development in the case with Heuermann's arrest, 3 of the murder victims associated with the case still had not been publicly identified. 2 of these victims were Peaches and her daughter, Baby Doe. However, in 2025, the public would learn that years of investigative efforts had finally led to their identification. On April 23, 2025, authorities announced that the woman previously nicknamed Peaches had been identified as Tanya Denise Jackson, and that her daughter, previously known as Baby Doe, was Tatiana Marie Dykes. Tanya was born on October 22, 1970, in Alabama, and served honorably in the Army from 1993 until 1995. Tatiana was born in Texas on March 17, 1995. At the time of their deaths, Tanya and Tatiana had been living in Brooklyn. It is believed Tanya had a job as a medical assistant at a doctor's office, and a female friend or neighbor watched Tatiana while she was working. Tatiana's father has been identified and is cooperating with police. Tanya and Tatiana were never reported missing because Tanya had fallen out of contact with most of her family during her time moving frequently with the Army, and she was estranged from most of her loved ones by the time she was killed. Authorities began using the investigative technique that ultimately led to Tanya and Tatiana's identifications 5 years before they were publicly identified. In 2020, investigators in New York partnered with the FBI to use investigative genetic genealogy in hopes of finally identifying Peaches and baby Doe. The process was long and tedious, but by 2022, they had focused in on some potential leads. In October of 2022, the Mobile, Alabama Police Department posted to their official Facebook page asking for the public's help. They were looking for relatives of a man named Elijah Howell or Howard. He was married to a woman named Carrie and lived in Pritchard, Alabama, before he died in 1963. Police stated in the post that Elijah's relatives may be able to help with the case of a woman and child who had been found out of state. The post also featured a photo of the peach tattoo and asked for anyone who recognized it to come forward. By 2023, the FBI had identified potential relatives of the mother and daughter. They shared this information with the local authorities in New York, who then traveled to meet with the family and collect DNA samples from them. These DNA samples proved that Peaches was Tanya Jackson and baby Doe was Tatiana Dykes. The identifications were actually made in early 2024, a full year before they were announced to the public. According to Detective Captain Stephen Fitzpatrick of the Nassau County Homicide Squad, the identifications could not have been made public earlier due to the needs of the investigation. The delay also allowed Tanya and Tatiana to be laid to rest prior to their identities being publicly released. They were buried in Alabama just a few weeks prior to the press conference announcing their identifications, with Tanya receiving full military honors at the funeral. While they have announced Tanya and Tatiana's identities, authorities are not revealing any information about their investigation into their murders. Rather, they made the identifications public for the sake of gathering more information. They are asking anyone who knew Tanya and Tatiana to come forward. This includes anyone who served with Tanya in the military, visited the doctor's office where she worked, or lived in her neighborhood in Brooklyn in 1997. Between July of 1993 and February of 1995, Tanya was stationed at 3 different military installations: Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, Fort Gordon in Augusta, Georgia, and Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. In 1997, Tanya and Tatiana were living at 230 54th Street in Brooklyn. Given the locations where their remains were found, Tanya and Tatiana's deaths have long been associated with the serial killings on Long Island. However, police are proceeding as though Tatiana and Tanya's murders are unrelated to Huerman's crimes, and will do so unless they are able to identify concrete evidence tying him to their deaths. Prior to Huerman's arrest, there was a theory that at least 2 killers had used the same remote stretch of Ocean Parkway as a dumping site for the remains of their victims. The murders of Tanya and Tatiana do appear to have some striking differences to some of the other victims found near Gilgo Beach. The Gilgo 4, the first 4 to be found, had all not been dismembered and had all disappeared between 2007 and 2010. Tanya and some of the other victims had gone missing years earlier and had been dismembered, with some of their extremities found along Ocean Parkway, but their torsos found discarded elsewhere. These differences could have been indicative of 2 different killers. However, after he was charged with the murders of the Gilgo 4, Huerman was charged with the murders of 2 of the victims whose remains had been disposed of in multiple locations: Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor, who went missing in 2000 and 2003, respectively. Huerman was also charged with the murder of Sandra Castilla, who was killed in 1993, after his DNA was matched to hairs that had been found on her body. If he is found guilty of her murder, it would mean that he started killing at least 4 years before Tanya and Tatiana were murdered. As such, these seemingly striking differences in time frame and disposal method do not appear to provide a solid division between which victims were allegedly killed by Herrmann and which ones were not. However, just because Herrmann could theoretically have killed Tanya and Tatiana, that does not prove that he did. Authorities are open to and working on every possible suspect they can identify. This is why they are actively seeking information from the public. According to Detective Captain Fitzpatrick, although Tanya and Tatiana have commonly been linked to the Gilgo Beach serial killings because of the timing and locations of their recovered remains, we are not discounting the possibility that their cases are unrelated from that investigation. Even if the murders of Tanya and Tatiana are unrelated to the other Gilgo Beach murders, hopefully the publicity generated by their potential connection to them will result in witnesses coming forward with testimony that could finally solve their cases. June 15, 1978, was the last day of school at Branham High School in San Jose, California. The following day, June 16th, the school's teachers were still there working, cleaning out their classrooms before the summer break. One of those teachers was Diane Peterson, who would later be described by a family member as a beautiful and wonderful person. When Diane should have been preparing for her summer break in her classroom, a student discovered her instead lying on the hallway floor outside of the room. She had been stabbed to death. Police did quickly have a potential suspect in the case, 16-year-old Harry Nicky Nickerson. Nickerson was arrested just 4 days after Diane was killed for an unrelated crime. However, once he was in custody, he began making statements about Diane's murder. He spontaneously told police officers that they were trying to pin the teacher's murder on him. He, again with no prompting from police, told them that he had not killed Diane and that he did not own a knife. While Nickerson's booking photo from that day is not publicly available, investigators noted that it bore a strong resemblance to a composite sketch developed with eyewitnesses from the scene of Diane's murder. In 1983, the parents of a Branham High School student came forward, telling police that their son had said he had witnessed Diane's murder, and that he had identified Nickerson as the killer. However, the student denied making such statements when interviewed by police. The following year, another witness came forward and told police that Nickerson had implicated himself in Diane's murder. The witness said that Nickerson had killed her after she discovered him in the middle of a drug deal at the school. The witness also reported that Nickerson carried around a knife with the words "teacher dear" written on it. Police were unable to corroborate the statement, and nothing came of it. In the years following Diane's murder, Nickerson kept adding on to an extensive criminal record. He was arrested and convicted of charges including armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and kidnapping. In 1984, he was shot and critically injured while he was trying to carry out a drug robbery. He ultimately died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1993. Diane's case was reopened by the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office Cold Case Unit decades after her death. Between 2023 and 2024, the unit worked with the District Attorney's Crime Lab to re-examine the evidence in the case to look for DNA. The effort was unsuccessful, so the Cold Case Unit then began going back and re-interviewing everyone connected to the case. One of the individuals they spoke to in 2025 was a relative of Nickerson's. During this meeting, this individual disclosed that Nickerson had admitted to killing Diane Peterson just minutes after the crime had been committed. After killing Diane, Nickerson had run to this relative's home and confessed to what he had just done. Investigators believe the relative, who has not been publicly identified, did not come forward in 1978 out of fear of retaliation from Nickerson. On June 2, 2025, 47 years after Diane Peterson was killed, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office and the San Jose Police Department released a statement formally identifying Nickerson as her killer. In the statement, San Jose Police Chief Paul Joseph is quoted as saying, "Nearly 5 decades have passed since a young teacher's life was tragically taken. While the suspect will never stand trial or face the consequences for his actions, we hope this resolution brings a measure of peace to the victim's loved ones and to a community that has carried this loss for far too long. Let this serve as a solemn reminder. No matter how much time passes, we will continue to seek the truth, because every victim matters, and every life deserves justice." "24-year-old Jeanette Ralston spent the evening of January 31st, 1977, at the Lion's Den bar in San Jose, California. Shortly before midnight, she left the bar with an unidentified man, telling her friends that she would be back in 10 minutes. She never came back. The following day, Jeanette's Volkswagen Beetle was discovered in the carport area of an apartment complex near the bar. Her body was wedged tightly in the back seat of the vehicle. She had been strangled to death with the long-sleeve shirt that was still tied around her neck. She had also been sexually assaulted. Her killer had attempted to set the car on fire, but had failed. Jeanette was survived by her husband and their 6-year-old son, Alan. Alan did his best to make peace with his mother's death and live his own life in the manner she would have wanted. "She raised me to be a happy kid, so I just held on to that. I've always tried to do good in my life and to try to respect her in any way I could," Alan would say in 2025, after an arrest was finally made in his mother's murder. The arrest was a result of a major break in the case that came in August of 2024, when all of the latent fingerprints from the crime scene were rerun through the FBI's fingerprint database. The database's search algorithm had been updated in 2018, which allowed for more accuracy in the search results, and as a result, investigators finally had a lead. They had identified a match to a fingerprint found on a carton of Eve cigarettes that had been at the crime scene. The fingerprint belonged to 69-year-old Willie Eugene Sims of Jefferson, Ohio. At the time of Jeanette's murder, he had been an Army private stationed to Fort Ord near the Monterey Bay. In 1978, he was convicted of assault to commit murder in Monterey County and was sentenced to 2.5 months in prison. He was released and moved out of California before it was routine for states to collect DNA samples from convicted criminals. In early 2025, investigators traveled to Ohio to collect a DNA sample from Sims. Testing then confirmed that his DNA was a match to DNA found under Jeanette's fingernails and on the shirt that had been used to strangle her. Sims was then arrested in Ohio and extradited to California to face charges for Jeanette's murder. He was arraigned at the Santa Clara County Hall of Justice on May 9, 2025. He did not enter a plea and is being held without bond. His next court date is scheduled for August 12th. If he is convicted, he faces 25 years to life in prison. In 1985, Christine Gallegos of Kearns, Utah, had a lot to look forward to. The 18-year-old with a sweet and outgoing personality was engaged to be married, and she and her fiancé Troy planned to start a family. On the evening of May 15th, Christine told her fiancé and some family members that she would be hitchhiking to downtown Salt Lake City to go to work. She worked at a bar, so she worked late hours. Witnesses saw Christine on 4000 West walking towards the freeway around 10:30 p.m. She was never seen alive again. It would later be estimated that she was killed just an hour after she was last seen. Christine's body was discovered by a passerby the following morning, just before 4 a.m. She was found near 1384 South Jefferson Street, just west of what was then known as Dierksfield. She had been severely beaten, stabbed, and shot twice in the head. She had fought fiercely against her killer, who also sexually assaulted her. Police believed she was killed by someone who picked her up while she was hitchhiking. That person then drove her to the remote location, rather than to the bar where she worked. After she was assaulted behind 1384 South Jefferson, she was able to fight her way out of the car. She was then stabbed, but continued to struggle, leaving a blood trail as she fought to get away until she fell near the gutter and was shot. DNA evidence was collected at the scene and run through national databases over the years, but no matches were ever found. Then, in 2023, investigators began looking into using genetic genealogy in Christine's case. Utah's Cold Case Review Board was able to secure a grant through the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. These funds allowed them to send the DNA from the case to Othram Inc. in Texas for advanced DNA analysis using genetic genealogy in late 2023. Othram was able to identify a potential suspect. However, the person they identified was deceased. Police were able to obtain a voluntary DNA sample from one of the potential suspect's sons. Testing of this sample confirmed that the man who had provided it was the son of the man whose DNA had been found at Christine's crime scene. On May 15, 2025, the Salt Lake City Police Department announced that Christine's case was being closed because they were certain that they had identified her killer as a man named Ricky Lee Stallworth. Stallworth had died of natural causes at the age of 65 in July of 2023, just a few months before the DNA that would tie him to the murder was sent to Othram. At the time of his death, he was living in Layton, Utah. At the time of Christine's murder, he had been a 27-year-old airman stationed at Hill Air Force Base in Davis County, Utah. Investigators have found no connection between Christine and Stallworth. It still appears likely that he picked her up while she was hitchhiking. Stallworth had 4 ex-wives and a habit of staying out all night with no explanation. At least one of his ex-wives was not surprised he was being investigated in connection with a murder when she was interviewed by police. Multiple members of Christine's family were present for the press conference announcing Stallworth's identification. Christine's mother, Leah, also gave a statement thanking law enforcement and saying that she still misses her daughter every day. In 1969, 30-year-old Sharon Kinne was one of the most infamous inmates at the women's prison in Iztapalapa on the east side of Mexico City, where she was serving a 13-year sentence for murder. Her fellow inmates gave her the nickname La Pistolera, the gunfighter, which was adopted by the Mexican press as her notoriety grew. An investigator back in her home state of Missouri, where she had been tried 4 times for 2 murders, had dubbed her the pistol-packing mama. The residents of both Missouri and Mexico were fascinated by the young, beautiful woman and her scandalous crimes. However, Sharon would not obtain true international infamy until December 7th, 1969, when she escaped from prison and became a fugitive. Her escape and the mystery of her whereabouts inspired both an international search and worldwide speculation. Her fate would remain unknown for more than 55 years. On January 30th, 2025, the Kansas City Police Department and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office held a press conference in Missouri to inform the public that they had finally learned how La Pistolera had spent her decades running from the law. Sharon's extensive interactions with law enforcement had begun more than 9 years before her infamous prison escape on March 18, 1960. That evening, 20-year-old Sharon and her family, her 25-year-old husband James, and their 2 children, had plans to attend a church meeting. James went to take a nap around 3:30 and asked Sharon to wake him up at 5:30 so that they could leave for church. Just before that time, Sharon went into the bathroom in their home in an unincorporated area of Missouri that is now a part of the City of Independence to get ready for the meeting before waking up her husband. Sharon later claimed that while she was in the bathroom, she heard her 2.5-year-old daughter say, "How does this thing work, Daddy?" and then a loud gunshot. Sharon claimed that when she ran into her bedroom, she found her daughter with her husband's .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol in her hand, and her husband with a single bullet wound to the head. James would be dead by the time he was transported to a local hospital. When police arrived at the scene, they did not perform any sort of testing for gunshot residue on the hands of either Sharon or her daughter. They could not pull fingerprints from the grip of the pistol because it was very well oiled. Neighbors and family members told police that James would let his daughter look at the guns he owned. The little girl was able to pull the trigger of a gun like the one that had killed her father when police performed a controlled test with her. Therefore, James Kinne's death was ruled an accident. Sharon collected $29,000, equivalent to more than $250,000 today in life insurance money. Sharon spending some of that insurance money would ultimately lead to her being connected to another death. Sharon used part of the payout to purchase a Ford Thunderbird convertible, which brought her into contact with a married car salesman named Walter Jones. Just a few weeks after becoming widowed, Sharon began an affair with Walter and reportedly wanted him to become her second husband, despite the fact that he had a wife and 2 children. On May 25, 1960, Sharon told Walter she was pregnant with his child. Instead of leaving his wife Patricia, as Sharon had expected, Walter broke off the affair. According to some reports, Patricia was also pregnant at the time. The following evening, May 26th, Patricia Jones never returned home from work. Walter filed a missing persons report with police and spent the following day looking for her. When he spoke to the women Patricia carpooled to work with, they told him that the previous day, Patricia had received a phone call at work from an unknown woman who wanted to meet with her. They therefore dropped Patricia off at a street corner in Independence, rather than at home as they normally did. They saw the woman, who was waiting in a car for Patricia, but did not recognize her, and could only provide a very general description of her. As imprecise as their description of the unknown woman was, Walter immediately suspected that it had in fact been Sharon Kinne. He called her to ask if she was in fact the woman Patricia had last been seen with, and Sharon admitted that she had met with Patricia on the 26th. She told Walter that she had contacted Patricia to tell her about the affair she was having with Walter, but in later testimony, Sharon would say that she had lied to Patricia and told her that it was Sharon's sister who was having the affair with him. Sharon claimed to have dropped Patricia off near the Jones family home, and to have seen Patricia talking to a man in a green Ford as she drove away. Walter did not trust this account and later went to see Sharon in person and demand that she tell him where his wife was. She did not. However, after she saw Walter, Sharon called John Boldes, a friend she had dated when they were in high school. She asked him to help her look for Patricia, which he was reluctant to do. Sharon convinced him to go out to a remote quarry road, a mile out of town, to look for her. There, they found the body of Patricia Jones. She had been shot 4 times, once in the head, once in the abdomen, and twice in the shoulders. John wanted to call the police, but Sharon ordered him to take her home and not mention her involvement with the discovery of the body to the authorities. John tried to comply with this order, but very quickly had to divulge Sharon's involvement when he reported the body to police. Police spent the next several days conducting various interviews, administering lie detector tests, and searching for physical evidence at the scene. Sharon Kinne, John Boldes, and Walter Jones were all investigated thoroughly. With Sharon connected to a murder, police also began looking into James Kinne's death again. It quickly became apparent that the Kinne's marriage had not been a happy one. Sharon had a number of affairs, including one with John Boldes. The location where they had found Patricia's body was one where they had previously gone to park a car and engage in said affair. Sharon had been trying to get James to agree to a divorce before his death, but she was demanding both money and their house as a settlement. James's parents were devout Mormons who encouraged him to stay in the marriage. However, on the morning of his death, James had told them that he had enough evidence of Sharon's infidelity to secure a divorce without having to agree to her outrageous financial demands. Patricia Jones was buried on May 31st, 1960. That evening, around 11 p.m., Sharon Kinne was arrested for her murder. She would later also be charged with her husband's murder. Sharon's trial for Patricia's murder was delayed due to her pregnancy. She gave birth to a daughter, alleged by Sharon to have been fathered by Walter Jones, on January 16, 1961. Sharon went on trial for the murder of Patricia Jones in June of 1961. The prosecution presented 72 exhibits of evidence and 27 witnesses. The prosecution's case was circumstantial. The main problem with their case was the fact that they could not produce the gun that had killed Patricia. Patricia had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm, the same caliber that had killed James Kinne. However, the firearm that killed James remained in police custody, despite Sharon's extensive efforts to have it returned to her. A man Sharon worked with did admit to buying a .22 caliber pistol for her on May 12, 1960, at her request. He had originally had the gun registered in her name, but changed it to his own name after Sharon got upset with him and insisted he do so. However, Sharon claimed to have lost the pistol. A box that could have contained it was found in the Kinne home, but not the firearm itself. Police had searched the area surrounding the crime scene in hopes that it had been disposed of there, but could not find it. While Sharon's co-worker's testimony showed that she theoretically had access to a .22 caliber pistol at the time of Patricia's murder, without the actual pistol, they could not perform testing to see if it was a match to the firearm that had been used in the murder. On June 22, 1961, an all-male jury found Sharon not guilty of the murder of Patricia Jones. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdict was read, and Sharon stopped to sign an autograph for one of the jurors on her way out of the courtroom. Sharon then went on trial for the murder of her husband in January of 1962. The prosecution argued that the Kinne's marriage had been about to fall apart due to Sharon's infidelity, and she knew she would not be entitled to any of James's life insurance money should they divorce before his death. The main witness for the prosecution was one of Sharon's lovers, John Boldes, who testified that while he was sneaking around with Sharon a few weeks before James had died, she had offered him $1,000 to kill her husband, and asked if he knew anyone who would accept the offer after he refused it. Sharon was found guilty on January 11, 1962, and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of her husband James. However, in March of 1963, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed her conviction and ordered a new trial on the basis of Sharon's defense having been denied adequate preemptory challenges during jury selection in her original trial. Sharon was released from prison after her brother Eugene posted her $25,000 bail. Sharon's second trial for the murder of her husband began on March 23, 1964, but ended in a mistrial after just a few days, when it was discovered that one of the jurors had previously retained one of the law partners of the prosecutor. Sharon's third trial for James's murder began on June 29, 1964. The jury was unable to reach a verdict, deadlocked at 7 votes to 5 in favor of acquittal, resulting in another mistrial. Sharon was set to go on trial for James's murder a fourth time in October of 1964, and remained free on the bail posted by her brother. However, a month before her trial was set to begin, Sharon left her children with James's father and left Missouri with a new lover, Frank Pugliese. While the couple was not actually married, they traveled and registered at their hotels as a married couple, and Sharon began going by the name Jeanette Pugliese. Legally, Sharon was allowed to travel under the terms of her bail, but under the terms of her agreement with her bond company, she was not to leave the state of Missouri without their written consent, which she never obtained. Sharon and Frank stayed at the Hotel Gin in Mexico City, but on the evening of September 18, 1964, Sharon was across town at a different hotel with a different man. 35-year-old Francisco Paredes Ordóñez was an American citizen who had been born in Mexico and had returned there for vacation. He was staying at the Hotel Levada. That evening, he walked into the hotel with a woman and told the night clerk, Enrique Martinez Rueda, that she was his wife as they made their way to his room. Sometime later, Enrique heard a gunshot coming from Francisco's room and ran towards it. On his way, he saw Sharon leaving the room. When she realized Enrique was going to try to stop her from leaving, she shot him in the shoulder. Enrique was still able to stop her, grabbing the gun and pushing her back into the room, where Francisco lay dead, shot twice in the chest. Enrique locked her in the room until the police arrived. Sharon claimed that she had gone to the hotel room with Francisco to look at some photographs after meeting him in a bar. She said that she had shot him with the intent to frighten, not kill him, when he made sexual advances towards her. The police did not believe her. They instead theorized that she had killed Francisco while she was attempting to rob him, as she and Frank had almost run out of money. She claimed to have shot Enrique because she believed he was coming to attack her. Francisco had been killed and Enrique had been wounded with a small gun Sharon had purchased after arriving in Mexico. However, when Sharon and Frank's hotel room was searched, police found a .22 caliber pistol. Testing of the pistol confirmed that it was the weapon that had been used to kill Patricia Jones. Despite a public outcry in Missouri and demands from the public that Sharon be retried for the murder, the prosecutor legally could not do so because of the double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment. On October 18, 1965, Sharon was found guilty of murder and attempted robbery and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Sharon appealed her conviction, but doing so increased her sentence rather than secure her freedom. 3 judges in Mexican Superior Court dismissed the attempted robbery charge, but found that Sharon's initial sentence of 10 years had been too lenient and increased it to 13 years. Because she had been in custody for Francisco's murder in Mexico on the day her fourth trial for the murder of James Kinne began, she obviously failed to appear in court for it. A capias warrant, in order to arrest an individual to ensure they appear in court after they fail to make a scheduled appearance, was issued, but authorities in Missouri were content to allow Sharon to serve her full sentence in Mexico before executing it. They never had the chance to, due to Sharon's escape from prison. The first indication that Sharon had escaped came at the 5 p.m. roll call on December 7, 1969, when Sharon failed to appear. She missed a second roll call later that evening. However, the prison did not notify Mexico City police of the escape until 2 a.m. At that point, a massive manhunt was launched. The search initially focused on the neighborhoods closest to the prison, but would soon grow to a countrywide and then international search. The most intensive searches ended after only about 10 days, as Mexican officials believed that by that time, Sharon would have already escaped the country. Numerous rumors flew about how Sharon had escaped prison. She had bribed prison guards. She had snuck out with the day's visitors, dressed as a man. She had taken a prison guard as a lover. She had been helped by fellow prisoners or by the family of one of her victims, who then killed her. There had been a blackout at the prison around the time Sharon would have escaped, and a review of the prison's procedures found that a door that should have been kept closed was routinely propped open, and that the facility was understaffed. So Sharon's escape could have had a much more mundane explanation. Where Sharon went after she escaped would remain a source of international investigation as well as speculation for decades to come, as authorities in Missouri continued to look for her and as public fascination with the fugitive grew, as the case continued to be covered in the media over the next 55 years. Sharon had become fluent in Spanish during her time incarcerated in Mexico, making any Spanish-speaking country a possible destination for her. A very early rumor held that she had escaped to Guatemala. Her main lawyer in Missouri owned a mountain ranch in Honduras, leading to speculation that she was hiding out there. Sharon's mother and brother had moved to Alaska, so some believed Sharon had followed them north. Despite ongoing efforts by police in Missouri, Sharon Kinne remained at large. She remained the subject of the longest outstanding warrant for murder in Missouri and one of the longest outstanding felony warrants in U.S. history. Authorities in Missouri announced to the public that the mystery of what had become of Sharon Kinne after she became a fugitive had been solved on January 30th, 2025. However, they had actually confirmed her fate nearly a year earlier, on May 31st, 2024, the 64th anniversary of Sharon Kinne's initial arrest. The tip that had ultimately pointed investigators in the right direction came in December of 2023. The Kansas City, Missouri Police Department and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous tip claiming that Sharon Kinne had died on January 21st, 2022, after living for nearly 50 years under an assumed name in Canada. Investigators learned that shortly after the death of the woman identified by the tipster as Sharon Kinne, a funeral home had taken 3 of her fingerprints, which were now stored in a database. They were able to subpoena these records. May 31st, 2024, the day it was confirmed that Sharon Kinne and this deceased woman were one and the same, was the day that the fingerprints from the funeral home were matched to Sharon Kinne's fingerprints on file with law enforcement. Sharon had lived out her days as Deidre D. Glabus in the small town of Tabor, Alberta. She had gotten married to a man named James Glabus in Los Angeles, California on February 2nd, 1970. Less than 2 months after escaping from prison in Mexico. She and her husband moved to Tabor in 1973. They owned the Tabor Motel for some time, and then they both went on to work as realtors and own the Century 21 agency in Tabor. At some point, Dee served as the chair of Tabor's Daycare Center Steering Committee. She has been described by Tabor residents as a kind and sweet woman. James Glabus died on August 11, 1979, at the age of 38. He was a diabetic and an alcoholic who died at home after falling into a diabetic coma following a night of drinking. Dee remarried in 1982 to a man named William L. They remained married until William's death from natural causes at the age of 79 on April 7, 2011. Dee died on January 21, 2022, with no one in her community knowing her true identity. Authorities in Missouri did originally plan to announce that Sharon Kinne had been identified and that her case was now closed due to the fact that she was now dead in mid-2024, shortly after the fingerprint evidence confirmed that she was Dee Glabus. However, they held off so as to, in their words, tie up some loose ends. It appears that there were some efforts made to further confirm that Dee Glabus and Sharon Kinne were the same person. The press release announcing the identification does state that forensic genealogy was used in making it, and it is known that Sharon gave birth in the years following her escape from prison. There is some more publicly available information about Sharon's family in Canada, as well as early failed efforts to use DNA testing to confirm the identification made in 2024. However, all sides of Sharon's family, both in Canada and in Missouri, do not want to be associated with her case any longer and have requested privacy. While there is a small amount of additional information available to the public, it is only about testing that never occurred, and it involves the identities and wishes of some members of the family. As such, I will not be going into detail about the potential use of DNA or other evidence in this case. There may or may not be further evidence confirming that Dee Glabus was in fact Sharon Kinne, but if there is, it is not public knowledge, so infringing on the privacy of her family members by discussing their identities or roles in the investigation does not serve any real purpose in the context of this video. As such, I will end on the words of unspecified members of the Kinne family, in the form of a statement they have released through a spokesperson on the matter. On behalf of the Kinne family, we would like to state how happy we are that this chapter in our family history can be closed. Sharon was a woman that never faced the consequences of her actions, leaving them for her children to deal with. She caused great harm without thought or remorse. Hopefully, this closure will allow the family a chance to heal from her traumatic legacy. Teresa Peroni faced hardship throughout her life, starting in her childhood. Her stepfather was abusive, which led to both Teresa and her brother running away from home multiple times. She suffered from epilepsy that was difficult to control, and her seizures made it difficult for her to hold a job. In 1974, when she was 18, Teresa ran away to Texas and got married. She believed that her life was finally on track. Unfortunately, that sense of stability was short-lived. Just a few years into her marriage, Teresa traveled to Northern California to visit family. While she was there, her husband had served her with divorce papers, and her life fell apart again. Teresa moved back to Oregon to be near members of her immediate family while she started her life over following her divorce. While she was there, she joined a local church, and her brother helped baptize her at a ceremony attended by their mother and other members of their family. Teresa's efforts to find a new community in Oregon did not always bring good people into her life. By 1983, 27-year-old Teresa was dating a 29-year-old man named Mark Sanfratello. Teresa was more of a free spirit, which Mark, who was very controlling, did not appreciate. Their relationship was very volatile, marked by arguments that could escalate into physical altercations. Mark was allegedly very upset that Teresa had joined a church, for example, and arguments would erupt over her involvement with it. Another major source of strife in their relationship was Mark's unsubstantiated belief that Teresa was cheating on him with a mutual friend of theirs with the nickname Rat Trap. The couple was seen arguing about this allegation on July 4th, 1983, at an outdoor party in Selma, Oregon. Nevertheless, Teresa and Mark were then seen walking into the woods looking for somewhere to sleep for the night. Teresa was never seen again. An official investigation was launched after Teresa's family reported her missing. However, preconceived notions and incorrect information may have negatively impacted the early investigation, convincing police that there was no criminal aspect to the disappearance. Teresa and Mark had been spending time with members of the Oregon offshoot of the Vermont-based People's Earth Park. The group embraced communal living and was known for drug use. Furthermore, a witness mistakenly reported seeing Teresa drunk at a bar later in July. Teresa's disappearance was therefore not actively investigated for many months. Then, in July of 1984, a year after Teresa went missing, a brown purse was taken to sheriff's deputies in Josephine County, Oregon. Inside the purse were items belonging to Teresa Peroni, including documents, her Oregon state ID, and her epilepsy medication. A search party with a cadaver dog was then sent to search the 20-acre property where she had last been seen, but nothing came of this search. While Mark Sanfratello was considered a person of interest in Teresa's disappearance at this point, he was not charged with any crime at the time. A year after Teresa vanished, he moved to California, got married, and soon committed multiple crimes unrelated to Teresa and her disappearance. In 1985, he was charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of burglary, after stabbing his wife and his 14-year-old stepdaughter. The stepdaughter told police that Sanfratello had beaten, choked, stabbed, and sexually assaulted her. Sanfratello ultimately pled guilty to just the 2 attempted murder charges and was sentenced to the maximum prison term of 15 years and 4 months. Then, in 1999, he was convicted on a count of theft or embezzlement of U.S. property in federal court in the Eastern District of California. He was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to pay $4,000 in restitution. Teresa's case, in the meantime, was still going nowhere. However, in 1997, a human skull was found on a property not far from where Teresa had last been seen. There was no other evidence at the scene identifying who the skull could have belonged to. In hopes of identifying this Jane Doe, investigators sent a sample from the skull, along with a DNA sample from Teresa's sister, to the FBI lab for testing. Unfortunately, the skull sample turned out to be from a tooth filling, so DNA testing was not possible. In 2004, a new investigator tried again to get DNA testing done on the skull, but the skull had gone missing. It was not located until 2020, when it was found in a genetic genealogy lab at the University of North Texas. Someone from the Josephine County Sheriff's Office had sent it there for safekeeping, but had then forgotten about doing so. When DNA testing was finally performed, the results showed a familial match to Teresa's sister. By 2022, the Jane Doe file and Teresa's missing person case file were filed under the same case number, but no further developments in the case were made public. Then, on June 27, 2025, a grand jury in Josephine County, Oregon, indicted Mark Sanfratello on a second-degree murder charge in connection to Teresa's case. The indictment came after, according to an Oregon Department of Justice press release, investigators re-interviewed witnesses, collected new DNA evidence, and used modern forensic testing to obtain new evidence. Sanfratello was arrested the following day without incident in Chico, California, where he had been living. He was a regular at various karaoke bars and open mic nights at various venues in Chico. Other regulars of the establishments he frequented have described him as quiet, angry, and radical. He was extradited to Oregon and had his first court appearance there on July 16th. "34-year-old Demond Taylor worked as a campus police officer at the Florissant Valley campus of St. Louis Community College. Prior to working there, he had been a security officer at St. Louis University and then a member of the Berkeley and Jennings police departments. On June 20th, 2008, Demond was driving in his white 1997 Chevrolet Cavalier to go pick up his two sons. Tragically, he never made it. He was driving on Page Boulevard in St. Louis and stopped at a red light at the intersection at Academy Avenue. There, Demond was shot in his car several times by someone in a different vehicle, which then sped away from the scene. Demond was pronounced dead at the scene. There was no obvious motive for the murder. According to Demond's family, he had no enemies. He was not wearing his uniform at the time of the shooting, so he could not have been killed as an act of random aggression against law enforcement. Almost immediately after Demond was killed, police were already telling his family that the murder had been a case of mistaken identity. A decade after Demond's murder, witness statements would corroborate that theory, but, frustratingly, it would take an additional 7 years for police to publicly disclose that and make an arrest. On August 23, 2025, the day before what would have been Demond's 52nd birthday, a press conference was held to announce that 46-year-old Brandon Levy was charged with first-degree murder in connection to Demond's case. Levy had been identified as one of the people who shot into Demond's car by a witness in July of 2018. The witness was allegedly present for the shooting and stated that Levy had mistaken Demond for a member of a rival gang. A second witness, one of Levy's cousins, also told police that Levy had shot Demond in a case of mistaken identity. However, no charges were filed at the time. Then, in July of 2025, a third witness, someone else who claimed to have been present for the murder, told police the same story, that Levy had shot Demond because he mistook him for a member of a rival gang. This led to Levy finally being arrested and charged. St. Louis Circuit Attorney Gabe Gore has stated that, presumably due to the ongoing legal proceedings, his office cannot comment on why charges were not filed against Levy after the two witnesses identified him in 2018. He has also said that the case against Levy is based largely on witness testimony. If the arrest were made possible by the third witness's account of events, it is possible that they provided further corroborating evidence, but if they did, it has not yet been made public. Levy was initially held without bond, but a judge later set a $50,000 cash bond. He was able to post the required 10% of that amount and was released from custody. He is next due in court on September 25th. On the morning of July 19th, 2005, a mourner went to the Cristo Rey Cemetery on the outskirts of Cotulla, Texas, a small town outside of San Antonio, to pay their respects at the grave of a relative. When they arrived at the cemetery, however, they made a horrifying discovery. Lying on the ground on the side of a dirt road that went through the cemetery was the lifeless body of a pregnant woman. The woman was 26-year-old Valerie Laguna. Valerie was the loving mother of 3 daughters. At the time of her murder, she was 8 months pregnant with her first son. She had last been seen in the very early morning hours of the 19th. Investigators would say in 2025 that Valerie appeared to have been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled, although other reports indicate that she had died specifically of blunt force trauma to the head. Despite the efforts of the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office, no answers came in the case. Over the years, they consulted with the FBI and worked with the Texas Rangers and the Texas Department of Public Safety's crime lab. Then, in 2021, Valerie's case was identified by the Texas Rangers as qualifying for the Texas Department of Public Safety's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. The funds from this initiative were used for DNA analysis at Bode Technologies. Multiple pieces of evidence had been sent to them the year previously, and DNA evidence had been identified. However, these new funds allowed for additional analysis of these items, and for the advanced analysis of additional pieces of evidence. This testing identified DNA belonging to 66-year-old Saul Gonzalez of San Antonio on some of the items of evidence. Gonzalez had been identified as a potential suspect earlier in the investigation. On August 29, 2025, a grand jury indicted him on 1 count of capital murder. He was arrested that same day and is currently being held at the LaSalle County Jail. Investigators can only release limited information about their investigation and the evidence against Gonzalez because of his pending prosecution. In a statement released after the indictment and arrest were made public, LaSalle County Sheriff Hector Ramirez said, in part, "This case has always been about more than just solving a crime. It has been about giving a voice to the victim, honoring her memory, and providing hope to her family. We know that nothing can erase the pain of the past, but we pray that this step forward brings comfort as we now move into the prosecution phase." In 2003, 50-year-old Paul Herlihy was living on Nashua Street in Milford, New Hampshire. He had purchased his house the previous December, with plans to live in one part of it and open an antique store in the other. That plan would never come to fruition. Paul was last heard from on August 23rd, around 8 p.m., when he left a phone message for his nephew. No one in his family could reach him over the next few days, so on August 27th, a relative called the Milford Police Department and asked for a welfare check. When police went inside Paul's home, they discovered his body. An autopsy determined that Paul's death was a homicide, but his cause of death was withheld from the public for decades for investigative reasons. In 2025, it was finally revealed that Paul had died from blunt force trauma. This revelation came after an arrest was finally made in the case. On June 29, 2025, Massachusetts State Police arrested 39-year-old Douglas Herlihy in Saugus, Massachusetts, on a fugitive from justice warrant. He was facing extradition to New Hampshire, where he was being charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, one for knowingly and the other for recklessly, causing the death of Paul Herlihy. He is also charged with falsifying physical evidence, a Class B felony, for allegedly moving or concealing the body. Douglas Herlihy is the youngest of Paul Herlihy's 4 sons. He was just 17 years old at the time of the murder. Very little information about Paul's murder had been made public prior to the arrest, but a 150-page affidavit released after the arrest included many disturbing details. Douglas Herlihy had been a troubled teenager, and his father Paul had been doing whatever he could to try and help him. But Douglas's resistance to his efforts created conflicts between them. Douglas had been living with his mother in Melrose, Massachusetts, but Paul made him move in with him in New Hampshire in hopes of getting him away from bad influences and off of drugs. Paul also paid off 2 of his son's drug debts to help free him from that world. Douglas had a criminal record consisting of offenses related to drugs and theft. He told friends that he hated his father and wanted to kill him. Milford police were called to the Herlihy home on multiple occasions, as Douglas had a tumultuous relationship with his father and other family members, which often resulted in him resorting to physical violence. Just prior to Paul's death, Douglas was facing charges for stealing his car. In March of 2003, Douglas and Paul's relationship improved some when Paul allowed Douglas to get his driver's license. Paul also purchased a 1995 Lincoln Mark 8, which he kept in his name but allowed Douglas to use, so long as he had good behavior. Douglas reportedly loved the car and was livid when his father took away his access to it after Douglas's behavior began to deteriorate again. Paul threatened to sell the car, but Douglas took the keys and left in it. On August 2, 2003, Paul reported the car stolen. Douglas was found in the car in Massachusetts 10 days later and arrested. Paul took Douglas to the Milford police station to self-surrender on the charge on August 18th. Douglas ultimately pled guilty and was given a 90-day suspended sentence. When Paul left his final message for his nephew on August 23rd, he was crying and upset because Douglas had left home again. Investigators say they can only place Paul's time of death as sometime between 8 p.m. on the 23rd, when he left a message for his nephew, and when his body was discovered on the 27th. However, witness testimony detailed in the affidavit indicates that Paul was most likely killed late on the 23rd or early on the 24th, according to testimony from Douglas's girlfriend at the time of the murder. She had gone with Douglas to his father's house on August 24th. Douglas told her that his father was away. She noticed a blue tarp covering something on the floor of the living room, and a fan blowing toward it. Douglas claimed that he and his father were doing some work on the house. They went into Douglas's room, and he behaved normally the entire time she was there. When police entered the home on August 27th, they found hundreds of flies and the strong stench of decomposition. Paul's body was found under a blue tarp in the living room, with a fan blowing towards it. Paul's wallet was found on his dresser, but it had no money in it, despite the fact that Paul routinely carried large sums of cash. A towel was covering the closet door in the room, and when it was removed, it was discovered that someone had written, "I will see you in hell," in all capital letters on it. Blood splatter analysis revealed that Paul had been attacked near his front door. It was also determined that objects from the kitchen, including the refrigerator, had been moved into the living room after Paul was attacked. According to the 2025 affidavit, a palm print found on the back of the refrigerator was found to be a positive match to Douglas. Douglas Herlihy continued to have run-ins with the law after his father's murder. On one of these occasions, he was arrested on July 2, 2020, in Melrose, Massachusetts, on unrelated charges. While in custody, he repeatedly kicked at the plexiglass in the booking area. A police officer told him to stop, or he would receive an additional charge for damaging property. Douglas then told him, "That's what I do. I beat cases. I beat my first body when I was 17. The officer took this to mean that Douglas had killed someone when he was 17. The arrest of Douglas Herlihy came after a multi-year investigation by the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit into the murder of his father. Douglas maintains his innocence, and, according to his lawyer, he looks forward to fighting the charges in court. Around 6 p.m. on December 29, 1979, the pilot of a forestry department spotter plane noticed smoke rising from brushland in Kerryn, a suburb of Perth, Western Australia. They had been in the area monitoring a brush fire. They discovered the horrifying source of the smoke the following morning in the Canning Dam catchment area, approximately half a mile south of Brookton Highway. It was coming from a smoldering tree stump, and the badly burned human body slumped over it. The body was that of 22-year-old Kerryn Tate. Her autopsy revealed extensive head and facial injuries. She had been beaten to death. Police believed a bloody chunk of wood found at the crime scene was the murder weapon. Kerryn had been born in Victoria in April of 1957, but her family had moved when she was just a year old, so most of her life was spent in Avalon Beach, New South Wales. She had a small circle of close friends, but a large group of social acquaintances. She was very comfortable being on her own and taking care of herself. She was kind, curious, and vivacious. Kerryn had moved across the country following a devastating loss. Kerryn was the mother of twin girls, but her daughter Amber died of sudden infant death syndrome in 1977, when she was just 5 months old. Kerryn left her other daughter with her father in Sydney and moved to Western Australia in 1978. In 1979, she was living on Barley Street in Mount Lawley, but at the end of the year, she was house-sitting at a property in Kerryn. Kerryn had spent the evening of December 28, 1979, at a dance held at the North Cottesloe Surf Life Saving Club. She then spent the night with some of her friends in Swanbourne. The following morning, Kerryn got a ride back to her Barley Street residence around 11 a.m. She was never seen alive again. What happened during the final 7 hours of Kerryn's life, between when she left her friend's home and when the smoke coming from the fire that had been set to her remains was seen, was a mystery to police. Trying to ascertain where Kerryn was and what she was doing during those hours was a major focus of the early investigation into her murder. Kerryn regularly hitchhiked, often enough that she carried a black helmet with her when she was out, just in case she was offered a ride on a motorcycle. This, of course, led police to theorize that Kerryn had been killed by someone she had accepted a ride from. A young woman did call police with an anonymous tip, saying that she had seen Kerryn on the back of a man's motorcycle on the day of her death. Police made appeals for the woman to come forward and provide additional information, but she never did. Several burned items had been found in a rough semicircle around Kerryn's body, which led to fears that her death had somehow been connected to witchcraft. Rumors flew that jewelry Kerryn had been wearing had secret occult meanings, and that she was a practicing witch. Individuals claiming to be white witches told the local newspaper that Kerryn's murder could be connected to black magic. These claims inspired some local hysteria, but they were all unfounded. Kerryn was very curious and open-minded, so she visited all manner of bookshops and was willing to listen to other people when they explained their beliefs, but she herself was in no way involved in the occult. Decades passed without answers in Kerryn's case. In 2023, the government of the state of Western Australia announced a $1 million reward for information in several cold cases, including Kerryn's, but the offer of the reward led to only a few calls and no solid answers. In 2024, Detective Senior Sergeant Steve Potter announced that male DNA had been found on items found at Kerryn's crime scene. The Western Australia Police Force's Special Crime Squad team was in the process of analyzing the DNA in hopes of identifying who it came from. The main technique they would be using was genetic genealogy. The effort was massive and time-consuming. 4 people worked on the case almost non-stop for a full year. They examined genetic profiles from the commercial DNA sites GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, and developed a family tree containing more than 10,000 people that went back to the 1600s. Most of the relatives of the killer initially identified by this effort were several generations removed from the killer, so tediously researching the links between all of the individuals in the family tree and expanding it took a lot of time and effort. In March of 2025, however, all of the work paid off. On March 13, 2025, cold case investigators with the Western Australia Police Force announced that they had been able to tie the DNA profile from Kerryn's crime scene to a potential suspect. As such, they were formally identifying Terence John Fisher as a suspect in Kerryn's murder. Unfortunately, that was all they could do, as Fisher had died of cancer 25 years earlier, and therefore could not be arrested and charged. Fisher was born on February 11, 1950, in Mount Lawley. From 1970 until 1972, he served in the Australian Army. He spent the majority of his service stationed in Townsville. Fisher got married in 1973, but he and his wife divorced in 1981. The marriage did not produce any children. Around the time of Kerryn's murder, Fisher was living mainly in Rivervale and Manning. He then lived with his father in Manning until his death from cancer on August 27, 2000. He had no criminal record and had only ever interacted with police for minor traffic infringements. When police announced that Fisher had been identified as a suspect in Kerryn's case, they also made another surprising announcement. They believed that Fisher was connected to 2 other cold cases not previously tied to Kerryn's case, the murders of Carrie Turner and Barbara Western. If Fisher did in fact kill all 3 of these women, he would be considered a serial killer. Carrie Suzanne Turner was born in September of 1972, the youngest of 3 children. In 1991, the 18-year-old was living with her parents in the suburb of Bickley and working part-time as a shop assistant. On June 29th, she and a friend hitchhiked from the friend's home in Armadale to Pinocchio's nightclub on Murray Street in Perth, arriving there around 10:30 p.m. She became separated from her friend once they got inside. Carrie was seen socializing with many different people throughout the night until she left the club alone around 4 a.m. on June 30th. Carrie got into a taxi outside the club, but the driver soon realized that she did not have the money to pay her fare, so he made her get out on the causeway in East Perth. Multiple witnesses saw her sitting on the curb or trying to hitch a ride. Another taxi driver picked her up, but he also realized that Carrie did not have the money to pay him, so he had her get out of his vehicle on Shepperton Road, near Millar Street, at approximately 5 a.m. A vehicle traveling southeast on Shepperton Road was seen pulling up alongside Carrie. Witnesses reported that Carrie got into the car, and it continued on. She was never seen alive again. Carrie's parents reported her missing on July 1st, and she remained missing for almost a month. Her body was discovered in bushland in the area of Bedfordale, near the Canning Dam, fully clothed and hidden behind a log. Barbara Ann Western was born in Perth on May 30th, 1948. She got married in 1967 and had 2 children, but the marriage ended after 5 years. Barbara then raised her children on her own. She had a very loving personality, which made her an attentive and caring mother, as well as a supportive friend to her wide social circle. Barbara began a new relationship 10 years after her divorce and began living with her partner a year into the relationship, but the couple did not marry. Barbara went out for the evening on June 27, 1986, leaving her home sometime between 6 and 7 p.m. She saw 2 friends at the Balmoral Hotel in East Victoria Park and ran into an acquaintance later in the evening at the nearby Irene's Park Tavern. Barbara was wearing a distinctive orange parka that night, which helped when police were later looking for witnesses. Barbara was seen leaving the tavern around 11:30 p.m. She never returned home. Barbara remained missing for almost 5 years. On March 14, 1991, 2 people were out collecting wood near Canning Dam in Kerryn when they came across what they believed to be human bones in a clearing roughly 50 feet off of the trail. Several items, including items of clothing and pieces of jewelry that belonged to Barbara Western, were found under a nearby tree trunk. Police were able to confirm that the bones were those of Barbara Western. It is unclear why exactly police believe all 3 women were killed by the same person. The main detail connecting all 3 cases is the locations where the bodies were found. The sites where the bodies of Kerryn, Tate, and Barbara Western were found had less than 100 feet between them. Kerry Turner's body was found approximately 4.5 miles away from those sites. Investigators believe there was a specific reason why Kerry was taken there, although they have not yet made that reason public. Authorities in Australia normally do not release very much information about suspects before they are convicted of a crime in court. This case is unusual, in that they have released quite a lot of information about Fisher to the public. They are hoping that by disclosing the places where he lived, worked, and socialized, they will hear from as many potential witnesses as possible. Investigators are very interested in gathering information about Fisher's movements and his routines, as they believe this information will provide them with more definitive answers in the 3 cases they now suspect him in. Fisher worked in construction for the Public Work Department, constructing government buildings in and around Perth. He took a voluntary redundancy in 1993 and started his own business. Fisher was also a prominent member of the Fremantle Sailing Club, where he both socialized and participated in offshore racing. He spent the early 1980s building a yacht at a warehouse in Carlisle and launched it in 1985. Fisher was also known to frequent pubs in Carlisle, Victoria Park, and Manning. Anyone who knew him from any of these places and could provide information about him is asked to contact Crime Stoppers. Police say that even the smallest of details could be critical to their investigation. In addition to making a public appeal for potential witnesses, investigators also executed a search warrant at the home where Fisher lived until his death. On March 13, 2025, they began what would ultimately be a 5-day search of the property, which included digging up the backyard. According to a police spokesperson, several items from the property were taken into evidence, with some of them being sent for forensic examination. Kerryn's sister Anne-Marie and brother Matt gave an interview following Fisher's identification. They expressed gratitude to all of the investigators who worked on their sister's case, as well as relief that Fisher is dead, both because it spares them the trauma of going through a trial, and because he can no longer hurt anyone else. They miss their sister, and find some peace of mind in the answers they now have. That being said, they also implored anyone who knew Fisher to come forward, as they could, unknowingly, be able to open up a new avenue of investigation that ultimately gives them even more answers about what happened to their sister. Kathryn Kate Beck was born in Albany, New York on March 1st, 1914, to Polish-born parents. She had one brother and 5 sisters. The Becks were a deeply religious Catholic family. Kate's faith would remain a central feature of her life. Despite this, when she got married, it was not in a church. On July 3rd, 1938, Kate married Jesse Blackburn in a City Hall ceremony. Jesse had been married previously, so they could not be married in the Catholic Church. While Kate could not enter into her marriage in accordance with her religious beliefs, those beliefs kept her in it. Kate and Jesse only lived together as husband and wife for a very short period of time. Jesse was in the United States Army Air Corps, which meant he had to move around a lot, both overseas and to various bases on the West Coast, based on where he was stationed. Kate was not interested in leaving her life in Albany and her family behind. Furthermore, based on letters they exchanged, the responsible and regimented Kate quickly grew frustrated with how unreliable and irresponsible her husband was. However, while they lived separate lives, the couple did not divorce, as doing so was against Kate's religious beliefs. They maintained a cordial relationship, periodically exchanging letters, although Kate would also sometimes get letters from the various girlfriends Jesse had over the years. Kate would even wire Jesse money if he needed it, which he often did. Once his service in the Air Corps ended, Jesse took a civilian job working for the Army, which eventually led to him moving to Japan. Kate was employed for 30 years at the Mohawk Brush Company, where she eventually became a forewoman. On Saturday, September 12, 1964, 50-year-old Kate worked half a day at the factory and arrived home around noon. Kate owned her 2-family house at 117 Colony Street in Albany. She lived on its first floor and rented out the upstairs apartment to supplement her income. Kate was well liked by her neighbors. She was known for being a kind but fairly private person. She was also known to her neighbors for sticking to a very strict routine. She was seen by neighbors between 5 and 6 p.m. on the 12th, sweeping her front porch, as she did every Saturday. This would be the last time anyone saw Kate alive. The last time Kate spoke to anyone would be a short time later, when she talked to one of her sisters over the phone. Kate attended the 6 o'clock Mass at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church every Sunday morning without fail. On September 13th, however, she was not at the service. She did not attend the 8 a.m. Mass either. Later in the day, neighbors noticed that she never came outside to do her normal Sunday chores, hanging her laundry out to dry and burning her trash. Kate was driven to and from work every day by her friend Marie Hogan. When Marie arrived at the Colony Street house on the morning of Monday the 14th, however, Kate did not come outside to get in the car. She did not answer the door either. Concerned, Marie reached out to Kate's 19-year-old niece, Sandy. Sandy had time before she had to start work that day, so she decided to go over to her Aunt Kate's house to check on her, since it was so unusual for her to deviate from her normal routine. She asked her sister Marianne to go with her, but Marianne said no, because she had to get to school. She had just started the 10th grade. Therefore, Sandy instead asked her Aunt Anna, another one of Kate's sisters, to go over to the house on Colony Street with her. Sandy and Anna knocked on the door, but, like Marie, got no answer. Sandy began tossing pebbles at various windows, hoping to get her aunt's attention in whatever room she was in at the time. There was still no answer from Kate. Sandy and Anna then realized they could get inside through the unlocked cellar door. They went through the basement and up the stairs, into the foyer shared by Kate's first-floor apartment and the stairs that led to the upstairs rental unit. The door to Kate's part of the house was unlocked, and Sandy and Anna were able to get inside. Kate was not anywhere on the first floor of the house. She did not answer when Anna and Sandy called her name. Initially, nothing seemed out of place anywhere on the first floor. Kate had told multiple people she would be painting the upstairs apartment in preparation for a new tenant, so Sandy and Anna went up the stairs to see if they would find her working on the apartment. When they reached the top of the stairs, they saw that the front door of the apartment was open. They also saw Kate lying on the floor of the unit's living room. They ran to call an ambulance to help her, but when it arrived, the paramedics called the police and told Anna and Sandy that there had been a homicide. Kate Blackburn was dead. Kate's body was found in the living room of the upstairs unit, but that was not where she was killed. Blood evidence at the scene indicated that she had initially been attacked in an entryway between the upstairs unit's kitchen and back bedroom. She had been struck on the back of her head multiple times, resulting in skull fractures. Some of her fingers were broken from Kate grabbing the back of her head after the first strike and interrupting the next blow. Investigators believe that Kate may have been attacked with items from her own home. The object used to inflict the head wounds may have been a small hammer or meat tenderizer taken from Kate's kitchen without her noticing. The killer could have taken it while Kate was getting the keys to the upstairs apartment from the lockbox in her bedroom where she kept them. After Kate was incapacitated or unconscious from the blows to her head and lying face down on the kitchen floor, the killer made the first of what would be numerous trips between the house's two apartments. He went downstairs and got one of Kate's kitchen knives. He then returned to the upstairs unit, where he turned Kate over onto her back and stabbed her once in the left side of her neck and once on the front of it. The second stab cut her carotid artery, and Kate bled to death. The killer then went downstairs and broke into a cedar hope chest in order to take a white linen sheet. He also brought up 2 pillows from Kate's bed. It appears that the killer had not anticipated the massive amount of blood that his crime would create. He dragged Kate's body into the living room, where it would later be discovered, and attempted to clean up the pool of blood left in the spot where he had killed her. He ultimately gave up and left the sheet near the large amount of remaining blood, which would eventually begin seeping through the floor and into the downstairs apartment where Kate had lived. After police concluded their investigation, the task of actually cleaning up the blood would be undertaken by Kate's nieces, Sandy and Teresa. While it was an upsetting task for both of them, they both wanted to spare their mothers the horror of seeing so much of their sister's blood. The killer had pushed up Kate's long brown dress and full-length petticoat so that they bunched around her neck and shoulders and cut away her bra. He then used heated knives to burn intricate lines that formed shapes on Kate's breasts and around her lips. There was no electricity in the upstairs apartment at the time, so it is believed he made multiple trips downstairs to place Kate's own kitchen knives in the burner flames of her own stove to heat them to the point where they could mutilate her body in such a manner. When he was done, the knives were then left under the stove cover. The killer then raped Kate's body, leaving behind seminal fluid. More than 300 people attended Kate's funeral mass at St. Joseph's Church and interment at St. Agnes Cemetery. More than 100 of the mourners were co-workers of Kate's at the Mohawk Brush Company. They had been given the day off to attend the services. 11 of Kate's co-workers served as either honorary or actual pallbearers. Police closely monitored the ceremony, watching the crowd at the burial from across the street and placing a microphone in Kate's casket, hoping to find clues in the case. Kate's distraught family was shocked that someone could hurt her at all, much less in such an abhorrent manner. Several of her loved ones were hysterical at her funeral. At the service, the family also became aware that Kate had been keeping a secret from them for quite a long time. She had been in a long-term relationship for the past 16 years. Kate had met Ben Maskin in 1948. Ben had previously survived polio. While he was still able to walk following his recovery, he did so with great difficulty. He sold produce for a living and lived with his mother. According to Ben, he and Kate had fallen in love shortly after they met, but their relationship had progressed very slowly, as Kate still took her marriage vows seriously, despite her long separation from her husband. Being involved with a man who was not her husband, in any manner, went against her religious beliefs, but so did getting a divorce. Further complicating their relationship was the fact that Kate was Polish and Catholic, and Ben was Jewish. At that time and in their community, a relationship that crossed these cultural and religious lines was still somewhat unconventional. A few of Kate's close friends knew about her relationship with Ben, but Kate could not bring herself to tell her family about him, since her relationship with him went against her religious principles. Kate was very close with her family, and they and their potential opinions were very important to her. While she did not feel as though she could disclose her relationship with Ben to her family, it does appear that she wanted him to get to know her loved ones in whatever limited capacity he could. When Kate's niece and goddaughter, Sandy, was working at a Carvel ice cream stand, Kate and Ben would park some distance away from it so that they could watch her work without being seen together. Kate would send Ben up to the counter to order so that Ben could meet Sandy, even though she would not realize his significance and just think he was a regular customer. Ben was interviewed extensively by police, and he fully cooperated with the investigation. It appears he cared for Kate dearly, and he was heartbroken over her murder. On the Saturday, Kate was last seen alive. He had spent the day at a local restaurant, playing card games with friends. He had tried coming over to see Kate late that evening, but she had not answered the door. He came back to see her the following day, after she should have gone to Mass, but again, she did not answer the door like she normally would. Ben waited for her in the neighborhood throughout the day, but never saw her. He tried calling her approximately 10 times, between Saturday and when her body was discovered on Monday, with no answer, which greatly concerned him. Ben was able to provide additional information about something police already believed may have been connected to Kate's murder, her renting out the apartment where her body was ultimately found. Kate had the same family as tenants in her apartment for many years. However, they had been forced to move out earlier in 1964 due to a death in the family. Kate began advertising the apartment in the Knickerbocker newspaper in July, and the ad ran for the final time on September 4th, just over a week before Kate was killed. Kate had told various people in her life that she had found a new tenant and that she would be painting the apartment and doing other tasks to prepare for them moving in on October 1st. According to Ben Maskin, however, Kate was wary of the man who had paid a $10 deposit to move into the apartment. Kate had described the new tenant to family members as a short man in his 50s. He had told Kate that he and his mother would be moving into the apartment. Kate was second-guessing her decision to rent to the man, however. He had smelled of alcohol when he had come to see the apartment. Additionally, he had given Kate his current address. Kate was suspicious because he claimed to live at 369 2nd Avenue, which was in a nicer section of Albany. Kate's home was in a decidedly working-class neighborhood. Kate found the idea of the man and his mother moving from a more desirable neighborhood into hers suspicious. Therefore, on the night of Wednesday, September 9th, she asked Ben to drive her over to see the house at the address the new tenant had given her. The address was legitimate, but it was too dark for Kate and Ben to determine which house was number 369. They then drove back to Kate's house, and Ben left later in the evening. He never saw Kate alive again. No one ever came forward identifying themselves as the man who had paid Kate the deposit, solidifying concerns initially raised by Kate herself that something was off with the potential tenant. In addition to the fact that she was killed in the apartment that was for rent, the last known contact with Kate seemed to confirm that renting out the apartment was what brought her killer into her house. Kate spoke to her sister on the phone in the early evening of September 12th. Her sister had wanted to bring Kate over some food for dinner. Kate told her no, because a tenant was coming to see the apartment. It is unclear if Kate meant that the man who had paid the deposit was coming over to see the apartment again before he moved in, or if Kate was having someone else who was interested in moving in over to tour the apartment. As uneasy as Kate was about the man who had paid the deposit, she may have tried to find a different tenant before he was due to move in. A scrap of paper with 117, the same number as Kate's house number, was found outside the house, leading to speculation that someone may have come looking for Kate's house, knowing the house number but not being familiar with the house itself. Kate's apartment was, for the most part, left untouched by her killer, with the major exceptions being the hope chest he broke into to find a sheet and the knives he used in the actual murder. However, the one item he specifically looked for and took part of supported the theory that Kate had been killed by the man who had previously paid her the deposit. Kate kept a rent receipt book in a hutch in her living room. She would fill out a slip of paper when she was paid rent or a deposit. The stub would remain in the book so that Kate would have a record of the payments, and she would rip out a receipt to give to the person who had paid her. The killer had gone through the hutch and found the receipt book, the last page of the book that had been written on, and the 4 pages behind it, including the stubs that were designed to remain in the book, had been ripped out. Police believed that the killer's name had been written in that book, and that he had taken the pages so that he could not be identified. Experts were still able to detect the faint impressions left on the paper by Kate writing on the pages, above the ones which remained, through indentation analysis. The name on the receipt for the $10 deposit was Robert Broadhead, or something similar. Various experts who examined the receipt book were confident in the first name being Robert, but could not be as certain about the last name. Other possible last names provided by various experts included Brand, Brandt, Boardhead, and Broadstead. The experts were also able to determine that the address listed on the receipt was 369 2nd Avenue, the same address Ben Maskin had provided to them when he described attempting to go to the address with Kate to check out the new tenant's claim of living there a few days before she was killed. Police investigated every man with a name that could match the one written by Kate in her receipt book, but they could not connect any of them to the case. As best as they could tell, the man had provided Kate with a false name. Police also investigated the people living at the address the man had given Kate, as well as people living in houses with the number 369 on other streets in Albany. Investigators did not limit their potential suspects to just men matching the description Kate had provided of the man who had put down a $10 deposit to move in on October 1st. This description came secondhand from Kate's family members, and they may have confused the new tenant with another man who had come to see the apartment. Information about Kate's murder was shared in several states, and investigators traveled as far as Connecticut to follow up on suspicious potential renters. A woman in Connecticut had called police to tell them about a man who had called her, asking to see an apartment she was advertising for rent. She thought the man sounded suspicious, and he had told her he was renting the apartment for himself and his mother, as Kate's new potential tenant had told her. Albany police were waiting for him when he came to tour the apartment. While he had been dishonest with the landlady, he had just been uneasy speaking with her because he was in fact renting the apartment for himself and his girlfriend. Despite the best efforts of police, time went on and no arrests were made in the case. Kate's home was eventually demolished. Kate's murder had a long-lasting, devastating effect on her family. The case also continued to have an effect on the members of the Albany Police Department for decades, which ultimately played a part in Kate's case finally being solved. Today, Melissa Morey is a commander with the Albany Police Department, but in 2018, she was a detective in the department's Forensic Investigation Bureau. In August of that year, her husband had attended a party with many of the department's retired detectives. Some of them were discussing old cases that had really stuck with them over the years. For many of them, it was the brutal murder of Kate Blackburn. Then Detective Morey's husband told her about the case when he came home, and she immediately took an interest in the case. She knew, because of her position in the Forensic Investigation Bureau, that evidence from cases even older than Kate's was still with her department, so she decided to look into what evidence from Kate's case was still available. She found that quite a large amount of evidence was still with the department, and that the investigators in 1964 had collected it carefully, ensuring that it would be well preserved. Detective Morey also learned that she knew someone named in the case file, Kate's niece Sandy, who had discovered Kate's body. Her husband informed her that this Sandy was their neighbor Sandy, who would compliment their dog while they were out walking it. The detective did not bring up the case with Sandy at the time in an effort to be sensitive to the fact that doing so might upset her. Detective Morey began organizing the case files and making inquiries about submitting some of the pieces of evidence for forensic testing. But her efforts on the case were temporarily interrupted when she was promoted to sergeant and moved to a new division. Then, in November of 2018, the Cold Case Analysis Center was founded at the College of St. Rose in Albany. Kate's niece Sandy saw coverage about the center's establishment on the local news and reached out to see if they could help with her aunt's case. They in turn contacted the Albany Police Department, and since Sergeant Morey had been working on the case recently, she was assigned to investigate it. In 2019, Kate's case was featured in the second season of the Cold Case Analysis Center's podcast, Upstate Unsolved, in hopes of identifying new witnesses and generating public interest in the case. Various options for forensically re-examining the evidence in the case were explored over the next few years, and eventually the best option was identified and funding for performing it was secured. In 2023, the Albany Police Department began working with Othram Inc. in Texas on advanced DNA testing after they received a grant from the nonprofit Season of Justice, which made financing the testing possible. A handkerchief, which had been found underneath Kate's body, was submitted for testing. Othram was able to use what is essentially a sterile wet vac system to extract DNA from the porous surface of the cloth. They then used forensic-grade genome sequencing to identify a comprehensive DNA profile. The profile was submitted to the FBI so that genetic genealogy could be used to identify a suspect. This effort did ultimately identify a man who potentially was the individual whose DNA was found at Kate's crime scene. Unfortunately, he had passed away in 1998. Police therefore approached his surviving relatives. They provided DNA samples for comparison and cooperated with the investigation fully, but they do not wish their involvement in the case to be publicly discussed beyond that. Their cooperation showed investigators that they were on the right track, so they moved forward with exhuming the potential suspect's body. The exhumation took place at Albany Rural Cemetery on September 15, 2025, 61 years and 1 day after Kate's body had been discovered. Samples were taken from a femur and an arm bone, and they were submitted for DNA testing. This testing confirmed that the deceased man's DNA was a match to the DNA found at the crime scene. On October 8, 2025, police in Albany announced that after 61 years, they had finally identified the killer of Kate Blackburn as Joseph Nowakowski. Nowakowski was born in Albany in August of 1931. There are no indications that he and Kate knew each other. His criminal activity began before he killed Kate and continued on in the years after the murder. He was in and out of prison for many years. In 1973, he was arrested in Schenectady, New York, for viciously attacking an elderly woman in the apartment where she lived alone. He was released from prison in 1980 after serving his sentence for that crime, and he did not have further significant contact with police for the last 18 years of his life. Now that his involvement in Kate's murder has been confirmed, his DNA profile is being uploaded to criminal databases in case he is tied to any other cold cases. Multiple members of Kate's surviving family attended the press conference announcing that the case was finally solved and that they finally had some answers about the crime that had impacted their family so deeply. Several of Kate's nieces spoke at the event to thank everyone who had worked so tirelessly on the case and to memorialize their beloved aunt. Carol Ann Dougherty was a happy-go-lucky little girl. She was an avid reader and a good child at both home and at school. In 1962, the 9-year-old was a 5th grade student at the school associated with her family's parish, St. Mark's Catholic Church. Carol Ann regularly rode her bike, a blue, white, and chrome Londoner racing bicycle, around her hometown of Bristol, Pennsylvania. She had received the bike on Christmas Day of 1961, which was the day after her 9th birthday. On October 22, 1962, she arrived home from school and changed out of her school uniform. Around 4 p.m., she left home on her bike to meet some of her friends at the Bristol Borough Free Library. Carol Ann had to return 2 books and was looking forward to checking out the next book in her favorite mystery series. She left home with enough time to stop at Tommy's Market to get a Coca-Cola and some penny candy. Carol Ann was last seen riding her bike on the sidewalk near St. Mark's Church. Dinner at the Dougherty house was always promptly at 4:45. Carol Ann's parents, Frank and Dorothy, were therefore concerned when she was not home in time to eat. They went out into the neighborhood to look for her. Dorothy found her daughter's bike parked outside of St. Mark's. It is believed that Carol Ann stopped at the church to say a prayer as she passed it, as the nuns at her school had encouraged their students to do. Dorothy did not find Carol Ann inside the church when she went inside, or when she went back to the church a short time later, as her search of the area continued. Frank went into the church looking for Carol Ann around 5:25 p.m. He did not find her in a pew saying her prayers. Instead, he found her dead body beneath a stained glass window in the vestibule of the choir loft. She had been raped and strangled. Carol Ann's sister Kay was not quite 3 years old at the time, but the guttural cry her father let out when he came home from finding Carol Ann's body was so upsetting that she can still remember it. The murder devastated the Dougherty family and changed the town of Bristol. Many of its residents locked their doors for the very first time that night. A massive investigation was launched by the Bristol police, which did quickly identify several suspects, thanks in large part to members of the local community calling in tips. A couple called police, concerned that their son was the killer because they had found Carol Ann's name written in one of his notebooks. Someone reported having seen him in the general area on the day of the murder with scratches on his face. However, he had in fact been in Virginia, taking a driving test at the time Carol Ann was killed, and had a receipt that was time and date stamped to prove it. A suspect did confess to Carol Ann's murder, but the case against him quickly fell apart. Handyman Frank Zucchero was seen stumbling down the street, seemingly intoxicated, and headed in the direction of St. Mark's Church around the time of the murder. Zucchero had a reputation for being the town drunk and only had a 5th grade education. According to a Bristol police officer, Zucchero confessed to the murder and provided details about it that only the killer would know. Zucchero was questioned by the Bucks County District Attorney, who thought that Zucchero sounded delusional. The police officer eventually admitted that he had made Zucchero confess under duress. Zucchero's alibi for the time of Carol Ann's murder was subsequently corroborated, and he was released. Police asked all of the priests assigned to St. Mark's Catholic Church about their whereabouts at the time of the murder. They were able to verify all of the alibis, except for one. Father Joseph Sabadish told police he had been visiting some of his parishioners at the time Carol Ann was killed, but when police questioned them, they said that the priest had not been there at the time. Other witnesses did say they had seen Father Sabadish within a few minutes of the time Carol Ann was murdered. However, they did not see him counseling parishioners, but acting strangely in a nearby shopping area. Police also located a receipt from a local women's lingerie store, whose owner identified Father Sabadish as a regular customer. He told her he was making the purchases for his wife, which, as a Roman Catholic priest, he obviously did not have. Father Sabadish had also recently been harassing a woman he had known when he was assigned to a parish in northern Pennsylvania. He would call her house to make lewd comments, threats, and sexual advances towards her. The woman's husband was able to record one of these phone calls and turned the tape over to Bristol police. Father Sabadish was interviewed multiple times by Bristol Police Chief Vincent Faragalli about Carol Ann's case, which was not appreciated by church leadership. Monsignor Paul Baird, the pastor at St. Mark's, was furious about Father Sabadish being questioned, as well as the insinuation that the priest could be involved in Carol Ann's murder. He refused to allow Father Sabadish to be questioned any further. He then publicly confronted Chief Faragalli while out on Mill Street in Bristol, screaming at him, "Faragalli, you're a Catholic and you are persecuting Catholics with this investigation." An unintimidated Chief Faragali yelled back, "No, Father, I'm a cop trying to figure out who killed that little girl in your church." With Father Sabatish now being withheld from them by his superiors, police had to get creative with their efforts to further investigate him. Chief Faragali and another police officer followed the priest as he made his regular visits to parishioners, and eventually grabbed him off the street. They took him to the county courthouse, where he underwent a polygraph examination. He passed the exam and was released. Father Sabatish was assigned to numerous parishes in the following decades, and died in 1999. He was later labeled a predator priest by the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. In 2005, he was on a list of Catholic priests credibly accused of sexual abuse, released following a grand jury investigation. Another suspect took several months to identify. A witness came forward reporting that they had seen a man with a distinctive facial scar outside of St. Mark's on the day Carol Ann was killed. In January of 1963, that man was identified as 24-year-old William Schrader. Schrader had been violent for almost his entire life. He was originally from Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, and he began acting violently when he was just 8 years old, when he hit a young girl in the face with a club. He was in and out of reform school until he joined the army at the age of 17. He was dishonorably discharged after just a year of service. Shortly after he left the army, Schrader shot at a man, was convicted of attempted murder, and incarcerated at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Schrader had moved to Bristol following his release from prison because he had a relative living there at the time. He often stayed at a center that housed transients in Bristol. At the time of Carol Ann's murder, he was living on Lincoln Avenue, just over a block away from St. Mark's Catholic Church. Schrader was brought in for questioning and denied any involvement with Carol Ann's murder. He told police that he had been working on the day of the murder and had not clocked out of his job at the Century Tool Company in Croydon until 4:30, the approximate time the witness said they had seen him outside the church. However, when police followed up on Schrader's alibi, they learned he had lied to them. Records showed that Schrader had clocked out of work at 1:58 p.m. on October 19, 1962, and did not return to work until October 24th, missing 3 scheduled shifts. When he was confronted with the evidence of his deceit, Schrader told police a new story, claiming that he had been installing a motor in his car at Gross's junkyard on October 22nd and 23rd. The owner of the junkyard could not recall if Schrader had actually been there on those days. His whereabouts at the time of the murder were unknown. Schrader provided a sample of his pubic hair and underwent a polygraph examination. After he passed the polygraph, he was released. Despite pursuing a number of promising suspects, investigators could not identify Carol Ann's killer or make an arrest. Carol Ann's parents never fully recovered from their daughter's death. Her mother, Dorothy, became emotionally withdrawn after her daughter's murder and passed away in 1975. Carol Ann's father, Frank, said in 1992 that he hoped he would live to see his daughter's killer identified. He lived until 2001, but, like his wife, he died without ever learning who had killed Carol Ann. Bristol Police Chief Vincent Faragali was also haunted by the question of who had killed Carol Ann Dougherty. He kept her picture on his desk at the police station until he retired in 1979, and he then displayed it in his home. He considered Carol Ann's case to be the most devastating of his career, and was frustrated that his department never got the break they needed to solve the case. He passed away in January of 2001 at the age of 81. Investigators kept revisiting Carol Ann's case as the decades passed, but the case would not be formally solved for more than 60 years. On October 29, 2025, Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Shorn announced that 2 days earlier, a judge had approved a 53-page report of the findings of the Bucks County Investigating Grand Jury, an anonymous grand jury comprised of randomly selected members of the public that is charged with examining evidence in cold cases in relation to the case of Carol Ann Dougherty. The grand jury formally found that William Schrader committed the crimes of rape and murder of the first degree in connection with Carol Ann Dougherty's death. According to the district attorney, the grand jury ultimately, independently, and collectively concluded that the investigation only allows the conclusion that William Schrader raped and murdered Carol Ann. Unfortunately, Schrader died in 2002 and could not be tried for these crimes. Based on the findings of the grand jury, however, the district attorney considers Carol Ann's case definitively concluded. After he was questioned about Carol Ann's murder and knew he was a suspect in the case, Schrader had fled Pennsylvania. He went first to Florida, and then to various locations in Louisiana and Texas, committing various criminal acts throughout his travels. He ultimately settled in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, and continued his criminal career. Schrader married a woman he met through her adult son, who had been incarcerated at the same Louisiana correctional facility as Schrader. Schrader's wife also had 2 daughters, both of whom had special needs. One daughter was an adult, and the other was a minor. Schrader began sexually abusing both of his stepdaughters, and eventually conceived a child with one of them. He began abusing that child, his own biological daughter, around the time she turned 8. More victims were brought into the household for Schrader to abuse. Schrader and his wife adopted a 2-year-old little girl, and they allowed a 12-year-old girl who had been their neighbor, Kathryn Smith, to move in with them as a foster child, only for Schrader to target her as well. On Halloween night of 1970, Schrader physically assaulted his wife after they got into an argument, which led to her adult son, his stepson, kicking him out of the house. As Schrader gathered his things before he left, he told his family, quote, "I'm coming back and I'm going to burn the house down and kill all the bitches inside it," end quote. Later that same night, a fire broke out in the house. All of the adults inside escaped, but some of the children did not. Schrader's 2-year-old adopted daughter was later found alive inside the house, but she only survived because Kathryn Smith had used her own body to protect her from the flames. Kathryn died, saving her little foster sister. The 2-year-old would go on to be abused by Schrader, her adoptive father, as she got older. Years after the fire, members of Schrader's family finally came forward with information about it. Schrader was convicted of arson and manslaughter in connection with the death of 12-year-old Kathryn Smith in 1985, 15 years after she was killed. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison. He died in prison at the age of 64 in 2002. Circumstantial evidence had been building up against Schrader in Carol Ann's case after he left Pennsylvania. A few years after Carol Ann's murder, one of Schrader's friends admitted that he had also seen Schrader outside of the church on the day of the murder. Police also learned that Schrader smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes. Cigarettes of that brand had been found at the crime scene. These details were not enough to charge Schrader with a crime, however. Police did continue investigating Schrader in connection with the murder of Carol Ann Dougherty. Schrader underwent polygraph examinations in relation to the case in 1985 and in 1993. He failed both of them, with the examiners who administered the tests concluding that Schrader had been attempting deception. Carol Ann's body had been found with pubic hairs clutched in her hand and on her leg. In 1993, forensic examination of the pubic hair sample Schrader had provided showed significant similarities to the pubic hairs on Carol Ann's body. In 1994, Schrader was brought back to Pennsylvania to testify before a grand jury. He did not answer any questions, instead invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. No charges were filed against him at the time. Then, in November of 2024, authorities in Bristol learned that Schrader had confessed to raping and killing a little girl in Pennsylvania to his stepson, Robert LeBlanc. Robert had gone to the police in Louisiana on 2 different occasions, in 1994 and in 2007, to report this information, but it was not relayed to the authorities in Pennsylvania at those times. They finally learned about the alleged confession in 2024 and went to Louisiana in November of that year to interview Robert. According to Robert, Schrader had told him on 2 separate occasions that he had raped and killed a little girl in Pennsylvania. He said that he had lured her into a church where he raped her. He told Robert that he, quote, had to kill the little girl in Bristol to keep her from talking, end quote. Investigators found Robert's account to be highly credible, as he was able to provide details of the crime he had not been given prior knowledge of. The statement from Robert LeBlanc was the second major development in Carol Ann's case in 2024. The month before, in October of 2024, evidence from the case was submitted to Othram Inc. in Texas for DNA testing after the funding for such testing was secured through grants. While the district attorney was optimistic that DNA testing would be possible, she did have reason to be concerned. The evidence from Carol Ann's case, including the pubic hairs, had been stored in the attic of the Bristol Borough Municipal Building, where it was exposed to extreme heat and cold for decades. DNA testing had been attempted in the 1990s, but found that the evidence was too degraded to be used. The evidence was still submitted to Othram, with the hope that advances in technology would allow for testing that was not possible 30 years earlier. Ultimately, it was not. The effort to develop a DNA profile from the evidence was unsuccessful. Investigators did still have some forensic evidence in the case, however. Technological advancements had made hair analysis more specific over the years. The pubic hair sample provided by Schrader in 1962 was found to be consistent with the hairs from Carol Ann's body. 141 pubic hair samples had been collected and tested as a part of the investigation, and Schrader's hair sample was the only one that was consistent with the hair from the crime scene. While this by no means comes anywhere close to being a definitive identification in the way that DNA could have potentially been, it does show that Schrader cannot be excluded as a suspect, and that all of the other known suspects in the case can be. In making their determination that Schrader killed Carol Ann, the grand jury took into account all of the circumstantial evidence, the alleged confession, the forensic exclusion of the other suspects by the hair evidence, and testimony from a clinical and forensic psychologist who was an expert in sex offender assessment and classification. The only surviving member of Carol Ann's immediate family, her little sister Kay, was present at the press conference announcing the grand jury's findings. In a statement, she thanked members of law enforcement and the media for their persistence in continuing to work on her sister's case over the decades, and also said, "Though nothing can bring Carol back, we can finally let her rest in peace, knowing that her story has been told, her truth revealed, and her memory honored." Andrea Michelle Reyes lived with her father, Carlos, in New Haven, Connecticut. On October 5th, 1999, just a month before Andrea's second birthday, she was abducted from her home by Rosa Tenorio, her non-custodial mother. Authorities believed that Tenorio had taken Andrea to the city of Puebla in Mexico. However, Mexican authorities did not recognize international parental abduction and refused to help return the little girl to her father. Carlos did everything he could to locate his daughter. He spent $11,000 on legal fees, private investigators, and bounty hunters looking for her in just the first year after she went missing, and he traveled to Mexico multiple times to search for her. He was unable to find her. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released age-progressed images of Andrea every few years, but the effort did not bring Andrea home. Then, in 2023, the case was reopened by New Haven police detective Keelan Nivikov, a member of the Special Victims Unit. She used multiple avenues of investigation, including witness interviews, social media, and search warrants, and ultimately identified a woman she believed could be Andrea. In 2025, DNA testing confirmed that the woman was Andrea Reyes, now 27 years old and living in Puebla, Mexico. A press conference detailing how Andrea had been found was held on March 12, 2025. Carlos and his wife Lucia were there to express their joy and to thank law enforcement for not giving up on finding Andrea, even after 25 years. At the time of the press conference, Carlos had only spoken to his daughter on the phone and through Messenger. An in-person reunion was being planned privately. The state of Andrea's relationship with her mother is unknown, and Carlos has long feared that his ex-wife would have done her best to use her exclusive influence to emotionally alienate his daughter from him and ruin their relationship. Carlos has acknowledged that navigating the complex emotions Andrea must be experiencing will be a long and involved process. The felony arrest warrant for Rosa Tenorio for custodial interference in the first degree is still active. However, it is only enforceable within the United States. It is believed that she is still living in Mexico, and she cannot be arrested unless she enters into the United States. In 1967, 59-year-old Roy George Benn lived in Sauk Rapids, Minnesota. He was the owner of St. Cloud Gas and Appliance Service and had recently purchased a 12-unit apartment building. His businesses had been very profitable, and he was doing very well financially. His wife had passed away the year before, but he still had a large extended family and seemed happy with his life. His loved ones were very concerned when he abruptly disappeared on September 25, 1967. Roy had been seen on the night of the 24th at King's Supper Club. He was wearing a dark-colored suit with a white French-cuffed shirt and a pair of gold and pearl cufflinks. Roy was last seen around 4 a.m. on the 25th, eating breakfast at a cafe attached to Claude's Shell Station on Highway 10 in Sartell, Minnesota, a town just a few miles from Roy's home. Roy drove away in his metallic blue 4-door 1963 Buick Electra, which went missing with him. Roy was known to carry large amounts of cash with him, as he paid cash for everything. He routinely bought rounds of drinks for his friends, so the fact that he always had cash on him was fairly well known. Roy's lawyer had reason to believe he may have had as much as $5,000 with him when he disappeared. As such, police suspected that foul play was involved in Roy's disappearance, and that he may have been killed for the money. They conducted interviews and identified a few potential suspects. Divers searched a flooded, abandoned quarry in St. Cloud and found 2 cars submerged under the water, but neither of them was Roy's car. Roy's family suspected he had been killed as well. His older brother Walter argued that Roy had just begun taking care of his new apartment building, and he was heavily involved with his service business, which required his constant attention. He did not have any debts to run from or anything else that would make him unhappy enough to abandon his life. None of Roy's lines of credit or bank accounts were used after he went missing. Roy was legally declared dead 8 years after he disappeared. Rumors about who could have killed him circulated for years, which was very upsetting to his family. They did not give up on their hope of eventually learning what had happened to Roy, even as decades passed without answers. They made appeals to the public, asking for information through the media, as recently as 2024. The following year, they would finally learn why Roy had disappeared nearly 60 years earlier. On August 9, 2025, 22-year-old Brody Locke of Watkins, Minnesota, was out fishing on the Mississippi River just north of the Sartell Dam, near the western shore of the river, with his friend, James Ham. Brody was using a sonar fish locator he had purchased just 4 days earlier. He noticed an image on its screen that at first he assumed was a large rock. The more he looked at it, however, the more it reminded him of the body shape of a classic car. James was not as convinced that what they were seeing was a car at the bottom of the river, 24 feet below their boat. Brody returned the following morning with some family members to get their opinion. They also believed that there could be a car under the water. They notified police. It turned out that Brody was correct. On August 13th, divers located the car, a 1960s-era Buick, and determined that there were human remains inside of it. There were concerns from law enforcement that the car would fall apart if they tried to remove it from the water. While the vehicle was heavily corroded and half full of sediment, it was successfully pulled out of the river. The vehicle's VIN number was a match to Roy Benn's car. One of Roy's family members had provided investigators with a DNA sample 7 years earlier during a review of Roy's case. Their DNA was compared to a DNA sample extracted from the remains found inside of the vehicle. A month after the car was found, the DNA results confirmed that the remains found inside of it were those of Roy Benn. The medical examiner's office ruled that there had not, in fact, been any foul play involved in Roy's death. They determined that Roy died as the result of a single motor vehicle crash with water submersion. It appears that Roy accidentally went off the road and into the river as he was driving. Roy's great-nephew, Jeff Benn, has stated that he is relieved that the mystery that has haunted his family for so long has finally been solved. Alice May Sullivan was a quiet, cheerful, and determined young woman from Gallatin, Tennessee. In August of 1986, Alice had just turned 20 and was beginning her sophomore year at Tennessee State University, where she was studying business. She had just moved out of her parents' home and into an apartment in Nashville, just 1.5 miles away from campus, with her boyfriend, Wayne. She was also working part-time at a Burger King to pay for her education, as well as support herself and her 3-year-old son, Darren. Despite the challenges of being a teen parent, Alice had done well in high school and was working to become the first person in her family to graduate from college. She dreamed of getting a good job to provide for not only herself and Darren, but also for her parents, James and Lily, who had done so much for her. Alice once told her mother that once she finished school and found a job, she would take care of her and see to it that she never wanted for anything ever again. On August 28, 1986, Alice got her son to preschool and attended her 8 a.m. class. After the class ended at 9:30, she went to Hankel Hall, an all-female dormitory, to visit with some friends. She mentioned to them that she might go to the library, but it is unknown if she ever did. She was seen walking near the Gentry Center, which is next to Hankel Hall, just before 1 p.m. She did not make it to her 1 p.m. class, and was never seen again. Alice was very close with her mother Lily, and the two of them spoke on the phone 2 or 3 times a day. On August 28th, Alice's father James also tried calling her a few times after he saw on the local news that someone named Alice Sullivan had won a vacation in a contest. Neither of Alice's parents ever got an answer when they called her apartment. The following morning, Alice's boyfriend Wayne finally answered when Lily called again. He told her that Alice had never come home the night before. She had also failed to be there to sign her son Darren off of the preschool bus when it brought him home at 3 p.m. Alice was very particular about who was allowed to care for Darren, but she did trust one of her neighbors to babysit him when she needed childcare, outside of the time he was at preschool. The neighbor signed Darren off of the bus and took him to her apartment when Alice was not there to get him. She later brought Darren to the apartment where he, Alice, and Wayne lived and left him with Wayne after he arrived home. The Sullivans were frustrated that Wayne had not done anything after Alice had failed to be there to get Darren. They immediately drove down to Alice's apartment and filed a missing persons report. The officer who responded to the apartment dismissed Alice as a young college student who had just run off somewhere and would return home soon. As such, Alice's apartment was never treated like a potential crime scene. It was never searched, and Alice's family was allowed to stay at the apartment. Alice was a very protective mother who would have never gone anywhere without Darren, and she was very close with her family, so she would not have gone anywhere without informing her parents. The Sullivans therefore knew that something was very wrong. Alice's boyfriend Wayne was out of the picture almost as soon as Alice disappeared. Lily Sullivan took a leave of absence from her job and moved into Alice's apartment to wait for news about her and to take care of Darren. She believed it would be less disruptive for him if he remained in the apartment. After a month, however, Lily's mother convinced James that Lily staying in her missing daughter's apartment was not good for her mental health. After James spoke with her, Lily ultimately agreed and moved back home with Darren. Alice remained missing, and the Sullivans raised Darren back in Gallatin. Alice's boyfriend was an obvious potential suspect in her disappearance. There may have been problems in the relationship, as just before Alice went missing, she had told her mother that she wanted to move back home, buy a car, and commute to school. Another potential suspect was the maintenance man at Alice's apartment complex. Alice had befriended the man, and he was later sent to prison after being convicted of rape and murder. Alice's son Darren grew up and had children of his own. He tried not to think about his mother's case very often, as it upset him. James and Lily Sullivan spent the next several decades waiting for answers about what had happened to their beloved daughter. For James, those answers never came. He passed away in 2020, 2 days before Thanksgiving, never finding the closure about his daughter's disappearance he had been dreaming of for more than 30 years. Nearly 5 years after his death, Lily would finally get at least some answers about their daughter's fate. On October 13th, 2025, 39 years after Alice disappeared, the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department announced that a skull that had been located more than 20 years earlier had recently been identified as belonging to Alice Sullivan. Forensic scientists at the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification had matched the skull to Alice through DNA, thanks to DNA samples that had been previously provided by Alice's parents. The skull had been discovered on February 20th, 2004, by a contractor who was building houses on Stokers Lake in North Nashville. Metro Nashville police officers, the medical examiner's office, and a state anthropologist coordinated an extensive search of the surrounding area, but they did not find any more remains. There were no signs of trauma to the skull, so Alice's cause of death remains unknown. The investigation into her death is ongoing. While questions remain about Alice's death, her mother is grateful to finally have at least some answers about what happened to her. A memorial service was held for Alice on November 8th, 2025, at her family church. Lily Sullivan told the Gallatin News, "We could never have had a service before because we just didn't know, but now we finally can. There's some peace in that." Teresa Fusco was a typical teenager who in general had a bubbly personality but was occasionally somewhat moody. In the fall of 1984, she was a junior at East Rockaway High School. She had 2 brothers and lots of friends. She loved dance, especially ballet and tap, and dreamed of becoming a dance teacher after she finished high school. Her parents, Thomas Fusco and Connie Napoli, were divorced, but they both remained active in their children's lives. Her father lived in Queens, while her mother lived in Lynbrook, New York, on Long Island. Teresa and her mother were especially close. On the afternoon of Saturday, November 10th, 1984, Teresa was in Lynbrook, but got out her suitcase so that she could begin packing, because she was going to her father's house the following day. Around 6 o'clock, she said goodbye to her mother and left to walk to her part-time job at the snack bar at Hot Skates, a skating rink just a few blocks away. After her shift, Teresa planned to go see her best friend Lisa at her house before coming home. Connie spent the evening playing board games with her son Michael and a friend from work. When she went to bed, Teresa was still not home, but she believed she was still at Lisa's house. When Connie woke up and went into Teresa's room, however, she realized that Teresa's bed had not been slept in, and Teresa had not done any more packing, as she had planned to do before she went to bed. Connie called Lisa's house to see if her daughter was still there. She learned that Teresa had never arrived there the night before. She began calling all of Teresa's other friends, asking if they had seen her. No one had. Connie then called the police. Teresa had clocked out of work at 9:47 p.m. the night before. She was last seen leaving the skating rink, in tears because she had just been fired for not wiping down the snack bar's tables properly. No further sightings of her were ever reported. Police took Teresa's disappearance seriously early on because less than 5 months earlier, on June 12, 1984, one of Teresa's friends, 15-year-old Kelly Morrissey, disappeared after last being seen walking along Earl Avenue in Lynbrook. Several months after Teresa disappeared, on March 26, 1985, 19-year-old Jacqueline Martorella of nearby Oceanside went missing. Playing off of the concept of the Bermuda Triangle, locals began referring to the area as the Lynbrook Triangle, since so many young women were mysteriously disappearing from it. Kelly Morrissey's disappearance has still not been solved. Jacqueline was located approximately a month after she went missing, but she was no longer alive. Her body was located on the Woodmere Country Club golf course. Her killer has never been found. Unfortunately, like in Jacqueline's case, Teresa's disappearance was solved, but in the worst possible way. On December 5th, 1984, less than a month after she went missing, 2 14-year-old boys were playing near the Long Island Railroad tracks between Rockland Avenue and Park Place, a location known to local kids as the Fort. There, they discovered Teresa's nude body under a wood shipping pallet and some leaves. Teresa had been strangled with a rope and beaten about the face. She had also been sexually assaulted. DNA was found on vaginal swabs taken during her autopsy. In 1985, several arrests were made in Teresa's case, beginning a decades-long ordeal marked by disputed evidence, overturned convictions, and later lawsuits against the county, but no actual resolution to Teresa's case. 27-year-old John Restivo was brought in for questioning on March 5th, 1985, after police interviewed a man with a history of mental health issues who claimed John had told him that he knew who killed Teresa. He was questioned by police for 2 days and eventually admitted to killing Teresa. However, he would later allege that he had been beaten and choked by police until he confessed. Police used the confession to convince a judge to allow them to wiretap the phone of one of John's friends, 31-year-old Dennis Halstead. Police recorded 20 seconds of a phone call, during which Halstead said "yeah" when asked if he had killed Teresa. He would later say that he was being sarcastic. He was nevertheless arrested. During his interrogation, John Restivo mentioned the name of 22-year-old John Coget as someone who was a friend of a friend and occasionally worked for him and his brother at their moving company. He was already being looked at by police because he had previously dated Teresa's missing friend, Kelly Morrissey. John Coget was brought to the police station and given 3 polygraph examinations. He was told at the time that he had failed all of them, but he had, in fact, passed them. He was interrogated for 18 hours and provided 6 different accounts of Teresa's murder, none of which contained any information not already known by police at the time. A detective wrote out the 6th version of events as a confession, and finally got John to sign it. According to this account, John Coget, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo had all been out in John Restivo's van on November 10th, 1984. They pulled over when they saw Teresa Fusco walking home, and she voluntarily got in the van. According to Teresa's loved ones, Teresa always called her mother about where she was going and what she was doing, and she would never have gotten into a stranger's vehicle. She refused to have sex with them, so Halstead and Coget forcibly stripped her, and Halstead raped her in the van. They drove to a cemetery where Restivo also raped her. She threatened to tell police what they had done, so Coget strangled her, and they drove to the area by the railroad tracks to dispose of the body. John Coget, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo were all charged with the rape and murder of Teresa Fusco, despite having strong alibis for the time of Teresa's abduction. They all pled not guilty. The only physical evidence in the case was highly controversial. Police claimed that they had found 2 hairs in John Restivo's van that were visually identical to Teresa's hair under a microscope. They were identical from root to tip, including the evidence of the hair being artificially treated. These hairs, and the limits of hair analysis, were highly contested in court, with investigators facing allegations that they had been planted in the van. John Restivo's van had been up on blocks at his mother's house on the night of the murder, so it could not have been used in the crime as prosecutors alleged. This called into question the entire contested confession and supported the allegation that the hairs had been planted. The hairs showed signs of advanced microscopic banding, which occurs when bacteria eat away at the hair shaft after death. According to defense witness and hair comparison expert Dr. Peter DeForest, this means that the hairs could not have been left in the van while Teresa was still alive. According to the statement John Cogut eventually signed, and the narrative of the crime prosecutors presented at trial, Teresa had been alive for almost the entire time she had been in the van. Her body was only in the van for a few minutes, while it was transported to the site where she was dumped, which was not far from the cemetery where she was allegedly killed. Another expert, serving as a witness for the state, argued that, quote, "For all anyone knows, banding occurs right after death, as when the heart stops and the lungs stop working and the blood settles," end quote. However, research into this topic was extremely new and limited, and there were no studies conducted about it, so saying that advanced banding could have been present in the hairs immediately at the time of death was pure speculation. The hairs in question were microscopically consistent in terms of the banding with Teresa's hairs that were collected during her autopsy. John Cogut was tried separately for the rape and murder of Teresa Fusco and convicted in March of 1986. Dennis Halstead and John Restivo were tried together and convicted of the same crimes in November of 1986. Centurion Ministries, a nonprofit that works to free innocent people convicted of crimes, began working with all three of the men convicted of killing Teresa in 1994. The Innocence Project also began working on the case a few years later. Throughout the 1990s, DNA testing was performed on the vaginal swabs taken during Teresa's autopsy multiple times. Each time, John Cogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo were all excluded as possible contributors of the DNA found on Teresa's body. The state argued that this was irrelevant, however, as the tested samples were not the best samples and could have failed to detect the three men's DNA profiles. The defense team was finally given access to the relevant property records in the case and learned that there was an intact vaginal swab that had never been tested. They were able to secure an order for it to undergo DNA testing. It was consistent with the unknown DNA profile found in the previously tested samples, and again excluded the three men who had been in prison for the past 18 years for the crime. In June of 2003, the convictions of John Cogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo were all vacated, and they were released from prison. John Cogut was retried first, as the case against him was considered the strongest because of his confession. His defense, therefore, was based largely on proving that the confession was false and coerced. For the first time in the state of New York, expert testimony about false confessions was allowed in court. The hair analysis expert who had testified for the prosecution at the 1986 trial provided an affidavit for the defense at the 2005 trial. In the 20 years of work he had done since the original trial, he had found that advanced banding only occurred on hairs attached to corpses that had been dead for at least 8 hours, but more commonly, weeks or months. This would mean that the hairs allegedly found in the van could not have been deposited there at the time of the murder. The hairs were consistent with the hairs taken during Teresa's autopsy, almost a month after her death. The expert had learned that the hairs from the autopsy had been stored in unsealed envelopes, so they could have been planted in the van or simply fallen out of an envelope and contaminated the evidence collected from the van. The state argued at trial that the DNA evidence did not exonerate John. They said that Teresa simply had a consensual sexual encounter with an unknown individual earlier on the day of her murder. However, according to both Teresa's mother and her best friend, Teresa was a virgin. Teresa's family believed at the time that there was a fourth man involved in the crime, that John Cogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo were all protecting. On December 21st, 2005, after a 3-month bench trial, John Cogut was acquitted of the rape and murder of Teresa Fusco. The charges against Dennis Halstead and John Restivo were dismissed 8 days later. All 3 men filed lawsuits against authorities in Nassau County, alleging that they had planted evidence, withheld evidence from their lawyers, and convicted them based on false confessions. A jury awarded Dennis Halstead and John Restivo each $18 million, $1 million for each year they had spent in prison. In John Cogut's separate civil suit, a jury found no wrongdoing by Nassau police in his case and awarded him nothing. Nearly 20 years after the end of the criminal proceedings against John Cogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo, another arrest was made in the rape and murder of Teresa Fusco. On October 14, 2025, 63-year-old Richard Bilodeau was arrested after a grand jury indicted him on charges of murder in the second degree, intentional murder, and murder in the second degree during the course of a rape, in connection to Teresa's case. He was arraigned in court the following day and pled not guilty. At the time of Teresa's murder, Bilodeau had been 23 years old and living with his grandparents at 16 Treadwell Avenue in Lynbrook, just 1 mile away from Teresa's home and workplace. According to people who had been his neighbors at the time, he had been a loner and a troubled young man. One neighbor reported that her children had been afraid of him. At the time of his arrest, he was living alone in Center Moriches, New York, and working nights at Walmart. He has no known criminal record and was not recognized by any of Teresa's surviving friends and family. The events that culminated in Bilodeau's arrest in October of 2025 began in November of 2023, when investigators sent the vaginal swabs from Teresa's autopsy to Othram Inc. in Texas for advanced DNA testing. The complete DNA profile they identified was sent to the FBI, who used forensic genetic genealogy to identify Bilodeau as a potential suspect. Other avenues of investigation were also pursued to see if he was a viable suspect in the case. The details of this part of the investigation have not been released because of the ongoing legal proceedings. Police began surveilling Bilodeau in early 2024. In February of 2024, they observed him drinking from a cup with a straw outside of a smoothie shop in Suffolk County, New York. They watched him throw away the cup and straw and collected them from the trash. DNA was extracted from the straw and found to be a 100% match to the DNA taken from Teresa's body. Police interviewed Bilodeau, who told them he had not known Teresa Fusco. He also said to them, when discussing the 1980s, people got away with murder back then. Bilodeau was not arrested until after the evidence against him was presented to a grand jury, and they handed down an indictment. The previous wrongful convictions in Teresa's case highlight how important it is to not jump to conclusions in terms of Bilodeau's guilt or innocence. Furthermore, the legal proceedings against John Cogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo could actively harm the prosecution's case. While DNA evidence is usually compelling, previous prosecutors publicly diminished the importance of the DNA sample now known to belong to Bilodeau during John Cogut's retrial in 2005. This could potentially be a large part of Bilodeau's defense and a major issue for the prosecution. In a statement to CNN, Bilodeau's court-appointed attorney, Dan Russo, said, "This incident took place over 40 years ago, and 3 men were convicted after trial and served almost 2 decades in prison before being exonerated. If ever a case exemplifies that someone accused of a crime is entitled to the presumption of innocence, it is this case." Teresa's mother, Connie, passed away in 2019, but but Teresa's father Thomas was present at the press conference announcing Bilodeau's arrest. He stated that he misses his daughter, but she lives on in his heart. The decades of legal proceedings have taken a toll on him, but he is optimistic that authorities have finally correctly identified the man who killed his daughter, and there will finally be a proper resolution to the case. He stated, "It's heartbreaking to go through this over and over again, but this time seems like a finalization, and I'm very grateful."